Mountains hide the darkest secrets. 11 real horror stories from the world's most dangerous peaks, verified deaths, unexplained disappearances, and documented terror that will make you question everything you thought you knew about these majestic landscapes. If you're brave enough to face the truth about what really happens when people venture too far into the wilderness, smash that subscribe button and hit the bell for verified fears. Warning: some mountains never give up their victims, and after tonight, you'll understand why. Let's move to our first story. Deep in the heart of North Carolina's Appalachian Mountains, where ancient peaks stretch endlessly toward clouded horizons and hiking trails wind through forests so dense they swallow sunlight whole, something inexplicable happened that continues to baffle investigators, search and rescue teams, and experienced hikers to this day. This is the story of what happens when the wilderness decides to keep its secrets, and how even the most prepared adventurers can simply vanish without leaving behind a single clue that makes sense. The Appalachian Trail has claimed many lives over the decades, but most disappearances follow predictable patterns. Hikers get lost, weather turns deadly, accidents happen on treacherous terrain, or medical emergencies strike far from help. What makes this case so deeply disturbing is that none of these explanations apply. This wasn't a case of someone wandering off the trail or succumbing to exposure. This was something far more unsettling: a methodical, almost surgical removal of human presence from a landscape, leaving behind only questions that grow more chilling the deeper you dig into the details. The investigation began on a crisp October morning, when a fellow hiker discovered an abandoned campsite along a remote section of trail near the North Carolina-Tennessee border. The campsite wasn't just empty. It was perfectly preserved, as if its occupant had simply evaporated mid-activity. The tent was still zipped shut, stakes driven securely into the ground, rainfly properly attached. Inside, a sleeping bag lay neatly arranged, still warm to the touch according to the first responders who arrived hours later. Personal belongings were arranged with an almost obsessive orderliness that seemed completely at odds with the chaos of a sudden emergency or attack. What investigators found inside that tent would become the foundation of one of the most perplexing missing person cases in Appalachian Trail history. The hiker's backpack sat upright against the tent wall, every compartment still properly secured and organized. Food supplies remained untouched, including a half-eaten energy bar that had been carefully rewrapped and placed back in its designated pocket. Water bottles were full, purification tablets accounted for, first aid kit complete and unused. The hiker's journal lay open to an entry dated the previous evening, the handwriting neat and unhurried, describing a peaceful day of hiking and anticipation for reaching the next shelter. But here's where the story takes its first turn into the genuinely inexplicable. The journal entry ended mid-sentence, not mid-word, not with a sudden scrawl suggesting surprise or panic, but mid-sentence, as if the writer had simply stopped existing while forming the letter E in what would have been the word evening. The pen lay beside the journal, cap still off, ink still flowing when investigators found it. Temperature readings suggested the campsite had been abandoned for less than 4 hours before discovery. Yet despite immediate search efforts involving dozens of volunteers and professional rescue teams, no trace of the missing hiker was ever found. The missing person was identified as Sarah Chen, a 34-year-old software engineer from Charlotte who had been hiking alone as part of a planned week-long solo trek through the southern Appalachians. Chen wasn't a novice hiker gambling with forces beyond her understanding. She was an experienced outdoorswoman who had completed sections of the Appalachian Trail multiple times, always following proper safety protocols, always informing others of her planned route and expected return. Her hiking registration was current, Her emergency contacts had been notified of her itinerary, and her GPS device had been functioning normally until the moment she disappeared. What made Chen's disappearance particularly unnerving was the complete absence of any logical explanation for why she would have left her campsite. The weather that night had been mild and clear, with no sudden storms or temperature drops that might have driven her to seek shelter elsewhere. Her tent showed no signs of damage, no evidence of animal interference, no indication that anything had threatened her safety or comfort. The surrounding area showed no footprints leading away from the campsite, no broken branches or disturbed vegetation suggesting someone had crashed through the underbrush in panic or haste. Search teams expanded their efforts over the following days, eventually covering more than 50 square miles of mountainous terrain with helicopters, search dogs, thermal imaging equipment, and hundreds of volunteers combing through dense forest on foot. They found nothing. No torn clothing caught on branches, no lost equipment, no signs of struggle. No indication that Sarah Chen had ever existed beyond that perfectly preserved campsite, where her story simply stopped. The search dogs, renowned for their ability to track human scent even days after a person has passed through an area, showed no interest in any trails leading away from the tent. They would circle the campsite repeatedly, whining and agitated, but refused to follow any scent trail beyond a roughly 20-foot radius from where Chen had last been seen. Local law enforcement treated the case as a potential homicide, suspecting that Chen might have been abducted and her campsite staged to look undisturbed. But this theory crumbled under scrutiny. The campsite's condition wasn't just undisturbed, it was impossibly pristine. Forensic analysis revealed that nothing had been moved or rearranged after Chen's disappearance. Dust patterns on her equipment matched exactly with how items would settle after days of undisturbed use. Even more puzzling, tire tracks and footprints from the search and rescue teams were clearly visible on the trail approaches to the campsite. Yet no other human traces could be found. It was as if Chen had been selectively erased from the landscape, while everything else remained exactly as she had left it. The investigation took an even stranger turn when Chen's GPS device was finally located 3 months later, not by search teams, but by a park maintenance worker cleaning debris from a stream nearly 8 miles from her campsite. The device had been wedged under a fallen log in water so shallow and clear that it should have been spotted immediately by the dozens of searchers who had crossed that exact stream multiple times during the initial search effort. When forensic technicians analyzed the GPS data, they discovered that the device had recorded Chen's location continuously until 11:47 p.m. on the night of her disappearance, showing her stationary inside her tent. Then, at exactly 11:48 p.m., the GPS recorded an impossible movement. The device had somehow traveled those 8 miles to the stream location in less than 1 minute, a feat that would require speeds of nearly 500 miles per hour over terrain that would challenge even experienced hikers on foot. What disturbed investigators even more than the impossible GPS data was what they found when they examined the device itself. The GPS unit showed no signs of damage, despite having spent months submerged in mountain runoff. The battery, which should have died within days of Chen's disappearance, was still holding a partial charge. Most unsettling of all, the device contained additional data files that hadn't been there during the initial investigation. Files that appeared to have been created weeks after Chen's disappearance, containing coordinates for locations throughout the Appalachian mountain range that Chen had never visited, some of them accessible only by helicopter or technical climbing equipment. The case officially remains open, though active investigation ceased after 18 months when every lead had been exhausted and every theory had been debunked by physical evidence. Chen's family maintains a reward fund for information leading to her discovery, but the reward notices now hang in mountain towns like memorial flags for the living dead. Constant reminders that sometimes people don't just get lost in the wilderness. Sometimes the wilderness decides to keep them, and when it does, it erases every trace so thoroughly that it's as if they never existed at all. Local hikers now avoid that section of trail, not because of any official danger, warnings, but because of something far more primitive. An instinctual understanding that some places hold secrets that human minds aren't equipped to process. Park rangers report that even experienced guides refuse to camp in the area where Chen's tent was found, claiming that the forest there feels wrong in ways they can't articulate. The campsite itself has been naturally reclaimed by undergrowth, but hikers passing through the area report an overwhelming urge to leave quickly, as if the mountain itself is watching and waiting for another opportunity to add to its collection of unexplained absences. Sarah Chen's disappearance represents more than just another missing person case in America's wilderness areas. It represents the terrifying possibility that some places on this earth operate by rules we don't understand, where the normal laws of physics, logic, and human experience simply don't apply. The mountains of Appalachia have swallowed Chen so completely that it's as if she never existed, leaving behind only a perfectly preserved campsite and the haunting knowledge that sometimes, when you venture into the wilderness alone, you might not be the only one deciding whether you come back out. Let's move to our second story. In the rugged mountains of southern Oregon, where dense forests give way to isolated meadows and military training grounds stretch across thousands of acres of unforgiving terrain, a group of highly trained United States Air Force security forces encountered something that would haunt them for decades. This wasn't a case of inexperienced civilians stumbling into danger they couldn't understand. These were professional military personnel, trained to handle threats both foreign and domestic, equipped with advanced communication systems and weapons, operating in an area they knew intimately. What they experienced that night challenged everything they thought they knew about their own territory and left them questioning the nature of reality itself. The incident occurred during a routine security patrol in October 1987, when Sergeant Mike Harrison and his three-man team were conducting their regular sweep of a restricted military zone in the Cascade Range. Harrison, a 15-year veteran with multiple deployments and commendations for bravery under fire, had led hundreds of similar patrols without incident. The area they were patrolling was familiar territory, a series of interconnected meadows surrounded by dense pine forests, accessible only by military vehicles due to the rough terrain and restricted access. The team knew every trail, every clearing, every potential security vulnerability in their assigned sector. The patrol began normally at 0600 hours, following standard protocols for sweeping the remote training areas for any unauthorized personnel or suspicious activity. Harrison's team consisted of three other experienced airmen: Staff Sergeant David Kim, Senior Airman Jennifer Walsh, and Airman First Class Robert Torres. Each carried standard-issue M16 rifles, tactical radios, and comprehensive first aid equipment. Their mission was straightforward: conduct a visual sweep of the outer perimeter meadows, check for signs of civilian intrusion, and report back to base by 1400 hours. It was the kind of routine assignment that military personnel complete thousands of times without incident. The first sign that something was wrong came at approximately 0930 hours when the team reached the largest meadow in their patrol sector, a roughly circular clearing about 200 yards across that they had visited countless times before. In the exact center of the meadow sat a bright orange picnic table, the kind typically found in state parks and camping areas. The table appeared to be new, its plastic surface gleaming in the morning sunlight, completely incongruous with the remote military setting. What made the discovery immediately unsettling was that Harrison's team had passed through this same meadow just 3 days earlier during their previous patrol, and the meadow had been completely empty. Harrison's first instinct was to assume that civilians had somehow bypassed military security and were using the restricted area for unauthorized camping or recreation. But as the team approached the table, several disturbing details became apparent. The picnic table showed no signs of having been transported to its current location. The ground around it was undisturbed, with no tire tracks, no footprints, no drag marks, or any other indication that heavy equipment had been used to move the table into position. The surrounding grass wasn't even flattened, as if the table had simply materialized in place without any human intervention. More troubling was the table's condition. Despite appearing new, the picnic table showed signs of extended use that didn't match its pristine appearance. The surface bore faint rings and stains that suggested years of use by countless visitors. Yet the plastic material looked as if it had just come from a factory. When Harrison ran his hand across the surface, he described later that it felt warm to the touch despite the cool October morning. And the warmth seemed to emanate from within the material itself rather than from any external heat source. The team's attempt to radio their discovery back to base revealed another disturbing element of their situation. Their tactical radios, which had been functioning perfectly throughout the morning patrol, suddenly produced only static when they tried to transmit from the meadow. The static wasn't the normal interference patterns they were trained to recognize and work around. Instead, it was a consistent, almost rhythmic pattern that several team members later described as sounding almost like distant conversation, though no actual words could be distinguished. The radio malfunction was limited to transmission. They could still receive communications from base, but their own transmissions were completely blocked. As the team stood around the orange picnic table trying to understand what they were dealing with, the atmosphere in the meadow began to change in ways that defied rational explanation. The normal sounds of the forest, birds calling, wind through the trees, the distant hum of insects, gradually faded until the meadow was enveloped in complete silence. Not the peaceful quiet of a calm morning, but an oppressive, unnatural silence that seemed to press against their eardrums. Harrison described the sensation as similar to the pressure changes experienced during high-altitude flights, but more intense and accompanied by a growing sense of being observed. The feeling of being watched became so overwhelming that the team instinctively formed a defensive perimeter around the picnic table, weapons ready, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement or threat. But the forest appeared completely empty. Through their rifle scopes and binoculars, they could see deep into the surrounding woods, and there was no indication of any human presence. No movement among the trees, no reflection of sunlight off equipment or weapons, no signs that anyone was observing their activities. Yet, the sensation of being watched continued to intensify until each team member reported feeling as if multiple sets of eyes were focused on them from every direction. Staff Sergeant Kim was the first to notice the temperature anomaly. Despite the cool October weather, the temperature within a roughly 50-foot radius of the picnic table began to rise noticeably. The team's digital thermometers, which had registered a normal 42 degrees Fahrenheit when they entered the meadow, now showed readings approaching 70 degrees in the immediate vicinity of the table. More disturbing was that the temperature change seemed to form a perfect circle around the table, with normal autumn temperatures just beyond the invisible boundary. When team members stepped outside this warm zone, they immediately felt the return of the cool mountain air. But stepping back toward the table brought them into the inexplicable warmth. The psychological pressure of the situation began to affect the team in ways that their military training hadn't prepared them for. Airman Torres reported feeling an overwhelming urge to sit at the picnic table, as if something was compelling him to use it for its intended purpose. Senior Airman Walsh described a growing conviction that they were trespassing in a space that wasn't meant for them, despite being on military property that they patrolled regularly. The feeling wasn't based on any rational threat assessment, but rather on a primitive, instinctual understanding that they had encountered something beyond their authority or comprehension. Harrison made the decision to document the anomaly before withdrawing from the area. Using their standard-issue camera equipment, the team photographed the picnic table from multiple angles and took extensive notes about the temperature readings, radio interference, and other unusual phenomena they were experiencing. But when they reviewed the photographs immediately after taking them, they discovered that the images showed only an empty meadow. The bright orange picnic table, which was clearly visible to all 4 team members and cast a distinct shadow on the grass, simply didn't appear in any of the photographs. The camera's automatic focusing system seemed to focus on the grass beneath where the table sat, as if the equipment couldn't detect the table's presence. The team's attempt to physically interact with the picnic table produced results that challenged their understanding of reality itself. When Harrison placed his hand on the table's surface, his hand appeared to the other team members to be resting on empty air, suspended about 3 feet above the ground. From Harrison's perspective, he was clearly touching a solid surface, and he could feel the smooth plastic material and the unusual warmth emanating from within. But his teammates saw only his hand floating in space, making contact with something that was invisible to them despite being clearly visible to Harrison. The situation became even more unsettling when the team attempted to leave the meadow. Despite following the same trail they had used to enter the area, they found themselves repeatedly returning to the picnic table after what should have been a straightforward walk to the forest edge. GPS readings showed that they were moving in the correct direction, but their physical location remained constant relative to the orange table. After 3 attempts to leave the meadow, resulted in them walking in what appeared to be straight lines, only to find themselves back at the table, the team began to experience the kind of panic that their military training was designed to prevent. It was Torres who finally discovered the method for escaping the meadow. While the others were studying their maps and GPS readings, trying to understand how they could be walking in circles in terrain they knew intimately, Torres noticed that the picnic table had begun to fade slightly, becoming more translucent as the morning progressed. Acting on instinct rather than tactical reasoning, he instructed the team to avoid looking directly at the table while they attempted to leave the meadow. By keeping the orange table in their peripheral vision and focusing their direct attention on the forest ahead, they were finally able to reach the tree line and continue their patrol. The team's report of the incident was classified immediately upon their return to base, and all 4 members were subjected to extensive debriefing sessions that focused more on their psychological state than on the details of what they had experienced. Official records indicate that the team underwent routine psychiatric evaluation following their patrol, with all members receiving clean bills of mental health. However, unofficial accounts suggest that base commanders took the report seriously enough to modify patrol routes to avoid the meadow where the orange picnic table had appeared. Follow-up patrols sent to investigate the site found no trace of the picnic table, no evidence of the temperature anomalies, and no indication that anything unusual had occurred in the meadow. Radio communications functioned normally throughout the area, and standard military equipment operated without interference. The meadow appeared exactly as it had during hundreds of previous patrols, giving no hint of the inexplicable events that had unfolded there just days earlier. All 4 team members were eventually transferred to different bases within 6 months of the incident, a personnel shuffle that military records attribute to routine reassignment procedures. However, none of the 4 ever spoke publicly about their experience in the Oregon mountains, and attempts by researchers to contact them for interviews have been unsuccessful. The official position of the United States Air Force is that no unusual incidents occurred during routine security patrols in the Oregon training areas during the period in question. The orange picnic table incident represents one of the most well-documented cases of military personnel encountering unexplained phenomena in remote mountain regions. Unlike civilian reports that can be dismissed as misidentification or imagination, this account involves multiple trained observers using professional equipment and following established protocols. The fact that their experience was immediately classified and that all personnel involved were quietly reassigned suggests that the military took their report seriously, even as official channels denied that anything unusual had occurred. What makes this case particularly disturbing is not just the inexplicable nature of the phenomena encountered, but the systematic way in which the experience was erased from official records. The orange picnic table, which appeared solid and real to multiple observers, left no trace of its existence beyond the memories of those who encountered it. In the remote mountains of Oregon, something had briefly intersected with our reality, presenting itself as an innocent piece of recreational equipment while demonstrating abilities that challenged the fundamental laws of physics and perception. Let's move to our third story. In the shadow of Virginia's Blue Ridge Mountains, where the Appalachian Trail winds through some of the most isolated wilderness in the eastern United States, a group of experienced backpackers discovered that sometimes the greatest danger in the mountains isn't the terrain, the weather, or the wildlife. It's other people. What began as a peaceful 3-day camping trip along a remote section of trail became a psychological nightmare that would leave its survivors questioning their safety in places they had once considered sanctuary. This is the story of how the wilderness can become a hunting ground, and how the thin veneer of civilization disappears completely when you're far enough from help that screaming serves no purpose. The incident occurred in late September 2019, when 4 college friends embarked on what was supposed to be their annual reunion camping trip along a lesser-known section of the Appalachian Trail near Shenandoah National Park. The group consisted of seasoned hikers who had been exploring Virginia's mountain trails together for nearly a decade. Marcus Webb, a 29-year-old engineer from Richmond; Sarah Martinez, a 28-year-old teacher from Norfolk; Jake Coleman, a 30-year-old photographer from Virginia Beach; and Lisa Chen, a 27-year-old nurse from Charlottesville. They weren't weekend warriors playing at outdoor adventure. These were experienced backpackers who understood mountain safety, carried appropriate gear, and had successfully completed dozens of similar trips without incident. The friends had specifically chosen a remote section of trail that sees relatively few hikers, seeking the solitude and natural beauty that draws people to wilderness areas in the first place. Their planned route would take them approximately 15 miles from the nearest road access, camping at established backcountry sites that were legal but rarely used due to their distance from popular trail sections. They had obtained proper permits, filed detailed itineraries with park rangers, and carried satellite communication devices for emergency situations. Everything about their trip planning reflected the kind of responsible outdoor recreation that park services encourage. The first indication that their trip would be anything but routine came on their second day, when they reached their planned campsite, a small clearing beside a mountain stream about 12 miles from the trailhead. As they began setting up their tents in the late afternoon, Jake noticed movement in the forest across the stream. Through his telephoto camera lens, he observed what appeared to be a man watching them from approximately 200 yards away, partially concealed behind a large oak tree. The figure was too distant to make out clearly, but Jake could see that the person was wearing dark clothing and seemed to be deliberately staying hidden while observing their activities. Initially, the group wasn't particularly concerned about the presence of another person in the area. Solo hikers and small groups often camp in the same general vicinity on popular trails, and it's not uncommon to encounter other backpackers throughout a wilderness trip. However, what made Jake uncomfortable was the observer's behavior. Rather than approaching their campsite to exchange the typical friendly greetings that are standard among hikers, the figure remained hidden and motionless, watching them in a way that felt distinctly predatory rather than merely curious. As the friends continued setting up camp, they became increasingly aware that they were being observed. Marcus spotted what appeared to be the same figure, or possibly a different person, positioned on a ridge overlooking their campsite from the opposite direction. Sarah noticed movement in the underbrush much closer to their location, suggesting that someone was moving through the forest while attempting to remain unseen. The realization that multiple individuals might be watching them from different positions transformed what had initially seemed like a minor encounter with another hiker into something far more threatening. The group's unease intensified when they discovered that their food storage area had been disturbed during a brief period when all 4 friends had left camp together to filter water from the stream. They had been gone for less than 20 minutes, but during that time, someone had clearly entered their campsite. The bear-proof containers where they stored their food hadn't been opened, but they had been moved and examined. More disturbing was the discovery that several personal items had been handled and rearranged. Sarah's sleeping bag had been unzipped and rezipped. Jake's camera equipment had been moved from where he had left it, and Marcus's hiking boots had been turned to face in different directions. The intrusion into their campsite represented a clear escalation from passive observation to active invasion of their personal space. The fact that nothing had been stolen suggested that theft wasn't the motive. Whoever had entered their camp had been more interested in examining their belongings and establishing psychological dominance than in taking anything of value. The message was clear. They were being watched, their privacy was being violated, and their sense of security in the wilderness was completely illusory. As evening approached, the friends faced a difficult decision. They could break camp and attempt to hike out in darkness over unfamiliar and potentially dangerous terrain. Or they could remain in their current location and hope that whoever was watching them would lose interest and move on. The decision was complicated by the fact that their planned route would take them deeper into the wilderness the following day, potentially moving them even further from help if the situation escalated. After lengthy discussion, they decided to maintain their position, but implement security measures that they had never needed to consider during previous camping trips. The group established a watch schedule to ensure that someone was always awake and alert throughout the night. They moved their tents closer together and positioned them so that anyone approaching the campsite would be visible from multiple angles. Most importantly, they made sure their satellite communication device was easily accessible and ready to transmit an emergency signal if the situation deteriorated. These weren't precautions that any of them had ever imagined needing during a recreational camping trip. But the afternoon's events had made it clear that they were dealing with individuals who had no respect for normal social boundaries or hiking etiquette. The night brought a systematic campaign of psychological terror that would haunt all 4 friends for years afterward. Beginning around midnight, their stalkers began a pattern of harassment designed to deprive them of sleep and increase their sense of vulnerability. The attack started with sounds. Branches breaking in the darkness around their campsite, footsteps circling their tents, and what sounded like whispered conversations just beyond the range of their flashlights. The sounds were clearly deliberate, intended to be heard and to create maximum psychological impact, rather than to maintain stealth. Around 2 a.m., the harassment escalated to physical interference with their campsite. Someone began shaking the guy lines of their tents, causing the structures to sway and creating the terrifying sensation that their only shelter was about to collapse. The shaking was rhythmic and persistent, continuing for several minutes at a time before stopping just long enough for the campers to begin relaxing, then resuming with increased intensity. The pattern suggested multiple individuals working in coordination, taking turns to ensure that the harassment never stopped long enough for the victims to fall asleep or let down their guard. The most terrifying aspect of the night was the realization that their stalkers were operating with complete confidence, that they could terrorize 4 people without consequences. The harassment wasn't the work of opportunistic criminals who might flee if confronted. This was systematic, coordinated, and carried out by individuals who clearly believed they had complete control over the situation. When Marcus shouted threats and demands that the harassers identify themselves and leave the area, he was answered only by laughter from multiple directions, making it clear that there were at least 3 or 4 people involved in the assault. By dawn, the 4 friends were exhausted, terrified, and facing the sobering reality that they were completely vulnerable to individuals who had demonstrated both the ability and willingness to terrorize them with impunity. The harassment had continued throughout the night without any reduction in intensity, suggesting that their stalkers had no intention of losing interest or moving on to other activities. More disturbing was the growing realization that the individuals tormenting them knew the area well enough to move through the forest in complete darkness without making unnecessary noise, until they wanted to be heard. The decision to break camp and attempt to reach safety was complicated by the fact that their planned route would take them deeper into wilderness areas, where their stalkers would have even more opportunities for harassment without risk of interference from park rangers or other hikers. However, remaining in their current location had clearly become untenable. The group made the difficult choice to abandon their planned itinerary and attempt to reach the nearest road access point, even though it meant hiking approximately 15 miles over challenging terrain while sleep-deprived and psychologically traumatized. The hike out became a nightmare of paranoia and exhaustion, as the group struggled to maintain alertness while covering difficult terrain as quickly as possible. Their stalkers continued to follow them throughout the morning, maintaining just enough distance to avoid direct confrontation, while making it clear that they were still being observed and hunted. The psychological pressure of knowing they were being tracked through the wilderness transformed what should have been a routine hike into a desperate flight from predators who seemed to view the forest as their personal hunting ground. The most disturbing aspect of their escape was the realization that their stalkers were toying with them rather than simply following. Several times during the hike, the group spotted their pursuers positioned ahead of them on the trail, suggesting that the individuals harassing them knew the area well enough to predict their route and move through the forest faster than people following established trails. The stalkers weren't just following, they were herding, controlling the group's movement and demonstrating that escape was only possible because they were allowing it. The friends finally reached the trailhead parking area in the early afternoon, exhausted and traumatized, but physically unharmed. Their immediate report to park rangers initiated a search of the area where they had been camping. But no trace of their stalkers was found. The rangers took the report seriously and increased patrols in the area, but no arrests were made and no similar incidents were reported by other hikers in the following weeks. The official investigation concluded that the group had likely encountered local individuals who were using remote areas of the park for illegal activities and viewed hikers as potential threats to their operations. What makes this case particularly disturbing is not just the systematic nature of the harassment, but the complete impunity with which it was carried out. The individuals who terrorized the 4 friends demonstrated intimate knowledge of the local terrain, suggesting they were either locals who knew the area well or people who had been operating in the region for extended periods. The coordination and persistence of their harassment suggested experience in psychological intimidation, raising questions about whether this was an isolated incident or part of a pattern of predatory behavior targeting vulnerable hikers in remote areas. The psychological impact on the victims extended far beyond the immediate trauma of their experience. All 4 friends reported difficulty sleeping for months afterward, with several experiencing panic attacks triggered by camping-related activities or even normal outdoor sounds. Sarah gave up backpacking entirely, unable to overcome the association between wilderness areas and the terror she had experienced. Jake continued hiking, but never again ventured into remote areas without large groups or armed companions. The incident transformed their relationship with wilderness areas from one of peace and recreation to one of vulnerability and potential danger. The case highlights a reality that many outdoor enthusiasts prefer not to acknowledge. Remote wilderness areas can provide perfect cover for individuals who view isolated hikers as easy targets for harassment, robbery, or worse. The very isolation that makes mountain camping appealing also makes campers completely dependent on the goodwill of anyone they encounter. When that goodwill is absent, when hikers encounter individuals who view the wilderness as a place where normal social rules don't apply, the result can be psychological terror that transforms peaceful natural settings into landscapes of fear. In Virginia's Blue Ridge Mountains, 4 experienced hikers learned that the greatest danger in the wilderness isn't always the mountain itself. Sometimes it's the people who treat remote areas as hunting grounds, where they can terrorize victims with complete impunity. Their story serves as a sobering reminder that when you venture far enough from civilization, you enter a realm where your safety depends entirely on the intentions of anyone else who might be sharing that isolated space with you. Let's move to our 4th story. High above the death zone of Mount Everest, where the air contains less than 1/3 the oxygen available at sea level, and every breath becomes a conscious struggle for survival, the human mind begins to fracture in ways that challenge our understanding of consciousness itself. This is the documented account of Jeremy Windsor, a 42-year-old British investment banker who, during his 2008 attempt to summit the world's highest peak, experienced a complete psychological breakdown that blurred the line between hallucination and reality. So thoroughly that even today, 17 years later, he cannot distinguish between what actually happened and what his oxygen-starved brain created during those terrifying hours above 26,000 feet. Windsor wasn't an amateur adventurer seeking bragging rights or a midlife crisis thrill. He was an experienced mountaineer who had successfully summited 6 of the world's 7 highest peaks, including K2, which many consider more technically challenging than Everest itself. His preparation for the Everest expedition had been meticulous, involving 2 years of high-altitude training, multiple acclimatization climbs in the Himalayas, and comprehensive medical screening to ensure his body could handle the extreme physiological stress of climbing above 29,000 feet. He had invested over $65,000 in the expedition, hired one of the most reputable guide services operating on Everest, and followed every recommended protocol for high-altitude mountaineering. The climb began normally in late April 2008, with Windsor following the standard route up the southeast ridge from Nepal. His team consisted of 8 other climbers and 4 experienced Sherpa guides, all led by a British expedition leader who had successfully guided more than 30 clients to Everest's summit over the previous decade. Windsor's physical condition during the initial stages of the climb was excellent. His oxygen saturation levels were within normal ranges for the altitude. He showed no signs of acute mountain sickness, and his performance during the acclimatization rotations suggested he was well adapted to the extreme environment. The first indication that Windsor was experiencing psychological difficulties came during the team's final night at Camp 4, located at 26,000 feet on the South Col. As the climbers prepared for their summit attempt, which would begin at midnight to take advantage of typically calmer morning weather conditions, Windsor reported to his tent partner that he could hear someone calling his name from outside the tent. The voice was clear and distinct, belonging to someone he identified as his childhood friend Jimmy Morrison, who had died in a car accident 15 years earlier while they were both university students. Windsor's tent partner, a Canadian surgeon named Dr. Patricia Chen, initially dismissed the incident as a minor altitude-induced hallucination, which are relatively common above 25,000 feet and typically not dangerous if they remain mild and brief. However, Windsor's conviction that Jimmy was present and attempting to communicate with him intensified throughout the night. He became increasingly agitated when Chen insisted that no one was calling his name and that no one named Jimmy was part of their expedition team. By morning, Windsor was engaged in detailed conversations with his deceased friend, responding to questions and comments that only he could hear. The expedition leader faced a difficult decision as the team prepared to begin their summit attempt. Windsor's physical condition remained strong, his vital signs were stable, his coordination was unimpaired, and he showed no other symptoms of severe altitude sickness. However, his psychological state had clearly deteriorated to the point where he was experiencing vivid auditory hallucinations and possibly visual hallucinations as well, since he occasionally gestured toward empty space as if acknowledging Jimmy's presence. The standard protocol would be to send Windsor down the mountain immediately, but he adamantly refused to abandon his summit attempt and insisted that Jimmy was encouraging him to continue climbing. Against his better judgment, the expedition leader allowed Windsor to continue with the summit attempt, reasoning that the hallucinations seemed benign and that Windsor's physical performance hadn't been compromised. This decision would prove to be a critical error that nearly cost Windsor his life and provided researchers with one of the most detailed first-hand accounts of severe, high-altitude psychological breakdown ever documented. Windsor wore a digital voice recorder throughout the summit attempt, initially intending to document his achievement for family and friends, but inadvertently creating an audio record of his complete psychological disintegration. The recordings, which Windsor later made available to altitude medicine researchers, provide a chilling real-time documentation of how extreme oxygen deprivation can completely alter human consciousness. During the early hours of the summit attempt, Windsor's recorded comments are relatively normal, consisting of typical observations about weather conditions, physical discomfort, and progress toward the summit. However, as the team climbed higher and oxygen levels continued to decrease, Windsor's commentary gradually shifted to include responses to Jimmy's supposed presence and advice. By the time the team reached 28,000 feet, Windsor was engaged in continuous conversation with his hallucinated companion, often ignoring direct questions from his actual climbing partners in favor of responding to Jimmy's comments. The recordings capture Windsor asking Jimmy about route-finding decisions, discussing memories from their university days, and even expressing gratitude for Jimmy's encouragement during physically demanding sections of the climb. Most disturbing was Windsor's apparent belief that Jimmy was physically present and actively assisting with the climb, at one point thanking his deceased friend for helping him navigate a particularly difficult section of the route. The situation became genuinely dangerous when Windsor began following Jimmy's navigation advice rather than staying with his actual climbing team. High-altitude mountaineering requires climbers to remain roped together and maintain visual contact at all times. But Windsor repeatedly attempted to deviate from the established route because Jimmy was supposedly showing him a better or safer path. His climbing partners were forced to physically restrain him on multiple occasions to prevent him from wandering off the route into areas where a single misstep would result in a fatal fall of thousands of feet. What makes Windsor's case particularly significant from a medical perspective is the detailed nature of his hallucinations and the way they evolved as his oxygen deprivation became more severe. Jimmy wasn't simply a voice or a vague presence. Windsor described seeing his friend clearly, including specific details about his clothing, facial expressions, and physical movements. More troubling was that Jimmy seemed to possess knowledge about the mountain and climbing conditions that Windsor himself didn't have, suggesting that his oxygen-starved brain was creating a hallucinated expert guide to help him navigate the extreme environment. The recordings capture the moment when Windsor's hallucinations took on a sinister quality that transformed Jimmy from a helpful companion into something far more threatening. As the team struggled through the most technically challenging section of the climb, approaching the Hillary Step at approximately 28,840 feet, Windsor's voice on the recording became increasingly panicked as he reported that Jimmy was no longer encouraging him to continue, but was instead trying to convince him to remove his oxygen mask and rest in the snow. The helpful friend had become a malevolent presence, actively trying to kill him through suggestions that would result in rapid death from hypoxia and hypothermia. Windsor's terror was palpable in the recordings as he pleaded with Jimmy to stop trying to harm him, begging his hallucinated friend to remember their positive memories together, rather than attempting to sabotage his survival. The other climbers, who could only hear Windsor's side of these conversations, described the experience as deeply unsettling. Watching a strong, experienced mountaineer argue desperately with empty air, while their lives depended on maintaining focus and coordination in one of the most dangerous environments on Earth. Several team members later reported that Windsor's psychological breakdown was more frightening than the physical dangers of the climb itself. The situation reached its crisis point when Windsor, following Jimmy's malevolent advice, actually began to remove his oxygen mask at 28,900 feet, less than 100 feet below Everest's summit. His climbing partner was forced to physically fight with him to prevent him from removing the equipment that was keeping him alive. While Windsor screamed that Jimmy was insisting the oxygen was poisoned and that he needed to breathe the natural air to survive. The struggle occurred on a narrow ridge where any loss of balance would result in immediate death, making the intervention both necessary and extremely dangerous for everyone involved. After the physical confrontation over his oxygen equipment, Windsor's hallucinations underwent another dramatic shift. Jimmy suddenly disappeared entirely, leaving Windsor in a state of complete psychological collapse as he realized that his companion throughout the climb had never existed. The recordings capture his sobbing confusion as he tried to understand how he could have been talking to someone who wasn't there, how he could have seen and heard Jimmy so clearly when his friend had been dead for 15 years. The sudden absence of his hallucinated companion left Windsor feeling more alone and terrified than he had ever experienced in his life. Despite his psychological breakdown, Windsor's team managed to reach Everest's summit, though he has no clear memory of achieving the goal he had spent years working toward. The recordings from the summit show Windsor in a state of complete dissociation, mechanically following his team's instructions, but showing no awareness of his accomplishment or appreciation for the spectacular views that represent the culmination of most climbers' dreams. His responses to his teammates' congratulations were flat and confused, as if he couldn't understand why they were celebrating or where they were. The descent proved even more dangerous than the ascent, as Windsor's psychological state continued to deteriorate, and he began experiencing new hallucinations involving multiple deceased friends and family members. He reported seeing his late grandfather standing on various ledges along the route, waving and calling his name, and became convinced that his dead university roommate was following the team down the mountain, always staying just out of direct sight, but occasionally visible in his peripheral vision. The combination of severe oxygen deprivation, physical exhaustion, and psychological trauma had completely destroyed his ability to distinguish between reality and hallucination. Windsor's condition didn't improve significantly until the team descended below 23,000 feet, where increased oxygen levels gradually restored some of his cognitive function. However, even at lower altitudes, he continued to experience confusion about what had actually happened during the summit attempt. He insisted that Jimmy had been present during the climb and became agitated when team members assured him that he had been hallucinating. The transition from complete belief in his hallucinations to gradual recognition that they hadn't been real was almost as traumatic as the original. Psychological breakdown. Medical evaluation after the expedition revealed that Windsor had experienced severe high-altitude cerebral edema, a condition where fluid accumulation in the brain causes increased intracranial pressure and can result in permanent neurological damage if not treated promptly. Brain scans showed evidence of minor tissue damage in areas associated with memory formation and reality testing, providing a physiological explanation for the severity and persistence of his hallucinations. The fact that he had continued climbing despite such severe cerebral impairment was described by altitude medicine specialists as both remarkable and extremely dangerous. The long-term psychological impact of Windsor's Everest experience has been profound and lasting. 17 years after the climb, he still experiences occasional brief hallucinations during times of stress or physical exhaustion, usually involving Jimmy or other deceased friends. He has undergone extensive psychiatric treatment to help him process the trauma of losing his grip on reality so completely. But he reports that the experience has permanently altered his understanding of consciousness and the reliability of human perception. The knowledge that his brain could create such convincing false experiences has left him with a persistent underlying anxiety about the nature of reality itself. Windsor's case has become a landmark study in altitude medicine, providing researchers with unprecedented insight into how extreme oxygen deprivation affects human consciousness. His detailed audio recordings and comprehensive medical follow-up have helped scientists understand that severe, high-altitude hallucinations aren't simply minor perceptual distortions, but can involve complete breaks from reality that persist even after returning to safer altitudes. The case has led to stricter medical protocols for high-altitude expeditions and better training for guides in recognizing and managing psychological emergencies. What makes Windsor's experience particularly disturbing isn't just the severity of his hallucinations, but the way they felt completely real and convincing while they were occurring. His brain, starved of oxygen and struggling to maintain basic functions, created an elaborate alternate reality that included detailed sensory experiences, complex social interactions, and even tactical climbing advice. The fact that these hallucinations could be so vivid and persistent while occurring in one of the most dangerous environments on Earth highlights the terrifying fragility of human consciousness when pushed beyond its evolutionary limits. In the death zone of Mount Everest, where every breath is a struggle and the margin for error approaches zero, Jeremy Windsor discovered that the greatest danger wasn't the mountain itself, but the way extreme altitude could transform his own mind into an unreliable narrator of reality. His story serves as a chilling reminder that in the world's most extreme environments, the human brain can become humanity's greatest enemy, creating false realities so convincing that they can lead directly to death. Sometimes, the most terrifying monsters we face in the mountains are the ones our own minds create when pushed beyond the limits of what consciousness was designed to endure. Let's move to our fifth story. Deep in the unnamed mountain ranges of Eastern Europe, where communist-era secrecy still shrouds countless acres of wilderness in administrative obscurity and bureaucratic silence, a discovery was made in 2012 that would challenge everything investigators thought they knew about missing persons cases, human endurance, and the lengths to which people will go to survive in impossible circumstances. This is the story of Klaus and Ingrid Zimmermann, a German couple who vanished without trace during a hiking expedition in 1972, and the 40-year-old diary that revealed a nightmare of captivity, psychological torture, and gradual descent into madness that makes their disappearance one of the most disturbing, unsolved cases in European criminal history. The Zimmermans were experienced mountaineers from Bavaria who had spent their honeymoon exploring the relatively uncharted mountain regions along what was then the border between East and West Germany. Klaus, 28, was a geology professor at the University of Munich with extensive experience in alpine environments, while Ingrid, 26, was an accomplished photographer who specialized in documenting remote wilderness areas for German travel publications. Their planned 3-week expedition in August 1972 was intended to be both a romantic adventure and a professional assignment, with Ingrid commissioned to photograph pristine mountain landscapes for a series of articles about undiscovered hiking destinations in Central Europe. The couple's disappearance initially attracted little attention from authorities on either side of the Iron Curtain. Their planned route took them through politically sensitive border regions where civilian access was heavily restricted, and both East and West German officials assumed that the missing hikers had either been detained by border guards or had fallen victim to the dangerous terrain and harsh weather conditions common in the area. The political tensions of the Cold War era meant that coordinated search efforts between the two German states were virtually impossible, and the couple's families were told that their loved ones had likely died in a climbing accident in terrain too dangerous and politically sensitive to search thoroughly. For 40 years, the fate of Klaus and Ingrid Zimmermann remained a mystery that was gradually forgotten as more pressing concerns occupied the attention of law enforcement agencies and the families affected by their loss. The fall of the Berlin Wall and German reunification in 1990 briefly renewed interest in Cold War-era disappearances. But the case files related to the Zimmermanns contained so little useful information that investigators quickly moved on to cases where evidence suggested better chances of resolution. The couple had simply vanished into the political and geographical chaos of a divided Europe, leaving behind only bureaucratic speculation and family grief. The discovery that would resurrect their case came entirely by accident in September 2012, when a team of German forestry workers conducting routine maintenance on mountain trails stumbled upon a partially buried metal container approximately 200 kilometers from where the Zimmermanns had last been seen. The container, a World War II-era ammunition box that had been deliberately buried beneath a large boulder, contained what appeared to be a complete diary documenting the couple's experiences during the weeks following their disappearance. The diary, written primarily in Ingrid's handwriting, but with occasional entries by Klaus, revealed that their disappearance hadn't been the result of an accident or political detention, but rather a calculated kidnapping that had trapped them in a nightmare of captivity that lasted far longer than anyone had imagined possible. The diary's opening entries, dated in late August 1972, described the couple's capture by unknown individuals while they were camping in a remote valley. According to Ingrid's account, they were awakened during their second night in the mountains by armed men who spoke in a dialect that neither Klaus nor Ingrid could identify, though they suspected it might have been a regional variation of Czech or Polish. The kidnappers, whom Ingrid referred to only as the men throughout her writings, appeared to be local residents who knew the terrain intimately and had been watching the couple's movements for several days before deciding to take them prisoner. What made the kidnapping particularly terrifying was its apparent lack of clear motive. The captors didn't demand ransom, didn't seem interested in the couple's equipment or money, and showed no indication of political motivation despite the sensitive border location where the capture occurred. Instead, according to the diary entries, the kidnappers seemed primarily interested in keeping Klaus and Ingrid alive, while subjecting them to a systematic program of psychological torture that appeared designed to break their will to resist or escape, rather than to extract information or achieve any practical goal. The early diary entries described the couple being forced to march deeper into the mountains to what Ingrid described as a place that doesn't exist on any map, eventually arriving at what appeared to be an abandoned mining complex that had been converted into a makeshift prison. The facility consisted of several underground chambers connected by tunnels that had been carved into the mountainside. possibly during the Soviet era, as part of a military installation or industrial project that had been abandoned and forgotten by official records. The isolation was complete. Ingrid wrote that even when they were allowed outside their underground cell, they could see no signs of civilization in any direction. Only endless mountains stretching to the horizon. The psychological torture began immediately and followed patterns that suggested their captors had experience in breaking down human resistance. Klaus and Ingrid were kept in separate cells most of the time, allowed to see each other only briefly and at unpredictable intervals that prevented them from developing any sense of routine or normalcy. They were fed irregularly and with varying quantities of food, sometimes receiving generous meals followed by days of near starvation, creating a constant state of anxiety about their basic survival needs. Most disturbing was their captors' apparent enjoyment of their prisoners' suffering. Ingrid wrote repeatedly about the men's laughter when Klaus or she broke down crying or begged for information about why they were being held. As weeks passed, the diary entries reveal the gradual deterioration of both prisoners' mental state under the constant stress of captivity and uncertainty. Klaus, who had initially maintained hope that they would be rescued or released, began showing signs of severe depression and paranoia, becoming convinced that their captors were planning to kill them slowly and that their suffering was being deliberately prolonged for the entertainment of their jailers. Ingrid's entries describe Klaus spending entire days in catatonic silence, refusing to eat or respond to her attempts at conversation during their brief periods together. Ingrid's own psychological decline is documented in excruciating detail through her diary entries, which become increasingly erratic and difficult to read as her mental state deteriorated. Her handwriting, initially neat and precise, gradually becomes more chaotic and urgent, with words frequently scratched out or written over repeatedly, as if she couldn't trust her own thoughts enough to commit them to paper permanently. She began experiencing hallucinations, particularly auditory hallucinations involving the voices of family members calling for help, and developed an obsessive fear that their captors were reading her diary entries and using the information to inflict additional psychological torture. The most disturbing aspect of the diary is its documentation of how isolation and prolonged stress gradually destroyed the couple's relationship with each other. Initially, Klaus and Ingrid had provided mutual support and comfort during their ordeal. But as months passed, they began turning on each other with increasing frequency. Ingrid wrote about Klaus, blaming her for their capture, claiming that her insistence on photographing remote areas had led them into the trap their kidnappers had set. Klaus, during his occasional diary entries, accused Ingrid of collaborating with their captors and suggested that she was receiving better treatment because she was providing information about their lives and families. The paranoia and mutual suspicion documented in the diary entries reveals how prolonged captivity can destroy even the strongest human bonds. Ingrid began to suspect that Klaus was secretly communicating with their captors and had agreed to participate in her psychological torture in exchange for better treatment or promises of eventual release. Klaus's entries show similar suspicions about Ingrid's behavior, and both began withholding information from each other and engaging in petty conflicts over food, space, and perceived favoritism from their jailers. The love and partnership that had brought them to the mountains together was systematically destroyed by the conditions of their imprisonment. As winter approached, according to the diary dates, the couple's physical condition began to deteriorate as severely as their mental state. The underground chambers where they were held were inadequately heated, and their captors provided only minimal clothing and blankets to protect them from the mountain cold. Ingrid wrote about Klaus developing a persistent cough that gradually worsened into what appeared to be pneumonia, while she herself suffered from malnutrition-related symptoms, including tooth loss hair loss, and chronic weakness that made even simple movements exhausting. The diary entries from this period are increasingly brief and incoherent, suggesting that both prisoners were losing the cognitive capacity to maintain detailed records of their experiences. The final entries in the diary, dated in early spring 1973, reveal that Klaus had died during the winter months, though Ingrid's account of his death is so confused and contradictory that investigators cannot determine whether he died from illness, malnutrition, or violence. Her descriptions of his final days alternate between claiming that he died peacefully in his sleep and suggesting that their captors killed him as punishment for attempting to escape. Most disturbing is her indication that she was forced to remain in the same cell with Klaus's body for an extended period before their captors finally removed it. An experience that appears to have completed her psychological breakdown. Ingrid's final diary entries, written in handwriting so deteriorated that forensic analysts required weeks to decipher them, document her complete descent into madness as she remained alone in captivity after Klaus's death. She wrote about conversations with Klaus's ghost, described elaborate escape plans that involved supernatural assistance from deceased family members, and recorded detailed accounts of torture sessions that may have been entirely hallucinatory. Her final entry, dated approximately 13 months after their initial capture, simply reads, "They are coming for me now," repeated dozens of times in increasingly erratic handwriting until the words become illegible scrawls. The discovery of the diary initiated a massive criminal investigation involving German federal police, Interpol, and local authorities from multiple countries in the region where the couple had disappeared. However, the investigation quickly encountered the same obstacles that had prevented resolution of the case 40 years earlier. The remote mountain region described in the diary contained numerous abandoned mining and military installations from various historical periods, but none could be definitively identified as the location where the Zimmermans had been held. The political upheavals of the past 4 decades had resulted in the destruction or loss of many official records that might have provided clues about who could have been operating clandestine facilities in the area during the 1970s. Forensic analysis of the diary confirmed that it had been written by Ingrid Zimmerman, based on handwriting samples provided by family members in comparison with other documents known to have been written by her before the couple's disappearance. The metal containers showed evidence of having been buried for approximately 40 years, consistent with the timeline suggested by the diary entries, and the paper and ink used were consistent with materials available in the early 1970s. However, investigators found no physical evidence that could lead them to the location where the couple had been held or provide clues about the identity of their captors. The most puzzling aspect of the case is how the diary came to be buried in a location so far from where the couple had disappeared and where, according to Ingrid's entries, they had been held captive. The burial site showed no evidence of recent disturbance, suggesting that the diary had been buried shortly after the final entries were written. But there was no indication of who had buried it or why. The location itself had no apparent connection to the abandoned mining facility described in the diary, leading investigators to speculate that someone, possibly one of the captors or a witness to the crimes, had deliberately chosen to preserve a record of what had happened while ensuring that it wouldn't be discovered until decades later. The psychological impact of the diary's discovery on the Zimmermans' surviving family members was devastating. After 40 years of uncertainty, they finally had answers about what had happened to Klaus and Ingrid. But the answers were far more horrific than anything they had imagined during the decades of not knowing. The detailed documentation of the couple's suffering, psychological breakdown, and gradual descent into madness provided closure of the most brutal kind, confirming that their loved ones had endured months of torture before dying in captivity, far from home and help. The case remains officially unsolved. though the statute of limitations for most potential charges has expired, and the likelihood of identifying the perpetrators after so many decades is virtually non-existent. The diary has been sealed in police evidence storage, though copies have been made available to researchers studying the psychological effects of prolonged captivity and torture. The document represents one of the most complete first-hand accounts of systematic psychological torture ever recovered, providing insights into human endurance and breakdown that have been valuable to psychologists and criminologists despite the horrific circumstances under which it was created. What makes the Zimmerman case particularly disturbing is not just the detailed documentation of their suffering, but the apparent purposelessness of their captivity and torture. Unlike political prisoners or kidnapping victims held for ransom, Klaus and Ingrid appear to have been taken and tormented simply because they were vulnerable and isolated enough to be captured without consequences for their captors. The randomness of their selection and the methodical nature of their psychological destruction suggests the existence of individuals who viewed human suffering as entertainment and had the knowledge, resources, and opportunity to indulge their cruelty with complete impunity. In the mountains of Eastern Europe, where political chaos and geographical isolation provided perfect cover for the worst aspects of human nature, Klaus and Ingrid Zimmerman discovered that some fates are far worse than death. Their 40-year-old diary stands as a testament to human endurance in the face of unimaginable cruelty, and a chilling reminder that in remote places far from civilization's protective influence, there are people who view other human beings as nothing more than subjects for experimentation in the limits of psychological torture. The mountains that had promised them adventure and beauty instead became the setting for a nightmare that lasted 13 months and was documented in excruciating detail by a woman whose love for her husband wasn't strong enough to survive the systematic destruction of everything that makes us human. Let's move to our sixth story. In the remote wilderness of Colorado's Rocky Mountains, where jagged peaks pierce thin air and pristine alpine meadows stretch for miles without a single sign of human habitation, a group of seasoned campers discovered that the greatest threat in the mountains isn't always the harsh environment or dangerous wildlife. Sometimes it's other humans who have decided that the isolation of the wilderness gives them license to terrorize anyone unfortunate enough to cross their path. This is the account of what happened to the Henderson family during what was supposed to be a peaceful weekend camping trip in August 2017, when they encountered individuals who transformed their remote campsite into a scene of psychological warfare that would haunt them for years afterward. The Henderson family consisted of parents, Michael and Jennifer, both in their early 40s, and their 3 children, 16-year-old Sarah, 14-year-old David, and 11-year-old Emma. Michael was an experienced outdoorsman who had been camping and hiking in Colorado's backcountry for over 20 years, while Jennifer, though less experienced, had accompanied the family on dozens of successful camping trips throughout the state. They weren't naive city dwellers venturing unprepared into dangerous territory. They were knowledgeable campers who understood mountain safety, carried appropriate gear, and had carefully planned their trip to one of their favorite remote locations in the San Juan National Forest. The family had chosen a dispersed camping area, approximately 12 miles from the nearest maintained road, accessible only by a rough 4-wheel drive track that discouraged casual visitors and ensured the kind of solitude they sought for their annual summer camping expedition. The location was a small meadow beside a crystal-clear mountain stream, surrounded by dense stands of aspen and pine trees that provided both privacy and protection from the mountain winds. They had camped in this exact spot 3 times over the previous 5 years without encountering any problems beyond the usual challenges of backcountry camping. Afternoon thunderstorms, curious wildlife, and the occasional equipment malfunction. The family arrived at their campsite on Friday afternoon and spent several hours setting up their camp according to well-established routines that had been refined through years of family camping trips. They erected 2 large tents, one for the parents and one for the 3 children, arranged their cooking area at a safe distance from their sleeping quarters, and properly stored their food in bear-proof containers positioned downwind from their camp. Michael and Jennifer were meticulous about following leave-no-trace principles and wilderness safety protocols, ensuring that their presence in the remote area would have minimal environmental impact and maximum safety for their family. The first indication that their weekend would be anything but peaceful came on Friday evening as the family was finishing dinner around their campfire. Sarah, who had been gathering firewood at the edge of the meadow, returned to camp with a disturbed expression and reported that she had seen what appeared to be another campfire flickering through the trees on the opposite side of the valley, approximately half a mile from their location. Initially, the family wasn't concerned about the presence of other campers in the area. The national forest was public land, and they had no exclusive claim to the region. However, what bothered Michael was that he hadn't seen any tire tracks or other signs of vehicle access that would indicate how other campers had reached such a remote location. As darkness fell and the Henderson family prepared for bed, the distant campfire across the valley was joined by at least 2 additional fires, suggesting that a significant group of people had established a camp in an area that Michael knew had no established camping sites or vehicle access. More disturbing was the sound that began to drift across the valley around 10 p.m. Loud music, shouting, and what sounded like the revving of motorcycle engines, all completely inappropriate for the wilderness setting and in clear violation of noise regulations that applied to national forest lands. The sounds continued intermittently throughout the night, making it difficult for the family to sleep and creating an atmosphere of unease that was completely foreign to their previous experiences in the area. Saturday morning brought a direct confrontation that would escalate the situation from mere annoyance to genuine terror. As Michael was preparing breakfast for his family, 3 men approached their campsite on foot, having apparently hiked across the valley from their own camp during the early morning hours. The men were dressed in military-style camouflage clothing and appeared to be in their 20s or 30s. With an aggressive demeanor that immediately put Michael on high alert. They claimed to be conducting training exercises in the area and demanded to know what the Henderson family was doing in their territory, speaking as if they had some official authority over the public lands where both groups were camping. Michael, drawing on his years of experience dealing with various personalities in wilderness settings, attempted to defuse the situation by politely explaining that his family had proper permits for dispersed camping in the national forest and had been using this particular area for years without any conflicts. However, the 3 men became increasingly hostile when Michael refused to acknowledge their claimed authority over the area, insisting that the Henderson family was interfering with important activities and should relocate to a different camping area immediately. The confrontation became more threatening when one of the men made pointed references to the Henderson children by name, despite never having been introduced to the family, suggesting that they had been watching the campsite and gathering information about its occupants. The realization that their family had been under surveillance by unknown individuals was deeply unsettling for both Michael and Jennifer. But the situation became genuinely frightening when the 3 men made it clear that they knew details about the Henderson family's planned activities and departure schedule. They referenced the family's planned hike to a nearby lake, mentioned specific gear that the children had been seen using, and demonstrated knowledge of the family's vehicle and license plate number. This level of detailed surveillance suggested that the men had been watching the Henderson campsite for an extended period and had been gathering intelligence with a thoroughness that went far beyond casual observation. After the 3 men left, ostensibly returning to their own camp across the valley, Michael and Jennifer faced a difficult decision about whether to abandon their planned weekend and evacuate the area immediately. The men hadn't made any direct threats of violence, but their aggressive behavior claimed authority over public lands, and obvious surveillance of the Henderson family created a situation that felt increasingly dangerous. The presence of 3 young children complicated any decision to leave, as breaking camp and hiking 12 miles to their vehicle in unfamiliar terrain would be challenging and potentially dangerous, especially if they were being pursued or harassed by hostile individuals who knew the area well. The family decided to remain in their campsite, but implemented security measures that they had never needed during previous camping trips. They consolidated their 2 tents into a single larger tent where the entire family could sleep together, moved their vehicle keys and satellite communication device to easily accessible locations, and established a watch schedule to ensure that someone was always awake and alert throughout the night. Michael also made the difficult decision to arm himself with the bear spray and hiking axe that he carried for emergency situations, despite having never imagined that he might need to defend his family from other humans in a wilderness setting. Saturday night brought a systematic campaign of harassment that would transform the Henderson family's peaceful camping trip into a nightmare of psychological terror. Beginning around midnight, the family was subjected to a coordinated assault on their sense of security that was clearly designed to maximize fear while avoiding actions that could be definitively classified as criminal behavior. The harassment began with sounds: footsteps circling their tent, branches breaking in the darkness around their campsite, and what sounded like whispered conversations just beyond the range of their flashlights. The psychological pressure intensified when the harassment escalated to direct interference with their campsite and equipment. Someone began shaking the guy lines of their tent, causing the structure to sway and creating the terrifying sensation that their only shelter was about to collapse. When Michael emerged from the tent with his flashlight and bear spray to confront whoever was harassing his family, he found no one visible, but discovered that several items had been moved around their campsite. Chairs had been rearranged, their cooler had been opened and closed, and their firewood had been scattered across the meadow. The most terrifying aspect of the night was the realization that multiple individuals were involved in the harassment, and that they were operating with complete confidence that they could terrorize a family with 3 young children without facing any consequences. When Michael shouted demands that the harassers identify themselves and leave his family alone, he was answered by laughter from multiple directions, making it clear that at least 4 or 5 people were surrounding their campsite and coordinating their activities to maximize the psychological impact on their victims. The harassment continued throughout the night with a methodical persistence that suggested experience in psychological intimidation. The family's tormentors took turns making noise, moving their equipment and creating the impression that their campsite was completely surrounded by hostile individuals who could approach at will. The children, particularly 11-year-old Emma, were terrified to the point of hysteria, while the older children struggled to maintain composure in a situation that challenged everything they had been taught about wilderness safety and human decency. By dawn on Sunday morning, the Henderson family was exhausted, traumatized, and facing the sobering reality that they were completely vulnerable to individuals who had demonstrated both the ability and willingness to terrorize them with impunity. The harassment had continued throughout the night without any reduction in intensity, suggesting that their tormentors had no intention of losing interest or moving on to other activities. More disturbing was the growing realization that the individuals harassing them knew the area well enough to move through the forest in complete darkness without making unnecessary noise until they wanted to be heard. The decision to evacuate their campsite and attempt to reach safety was complicated by the fact that their tormentors had demonstrated the ability to surround and monitor their camp, suggesting that any attempt to leave would be observed and potentially intercepted. However, remaining in their current location had clearly become untenable, especially with 3 children who were showing signs of severe psychological trauma from the night's events. Michael made the difficult choice to break camp in broad daylight, reasoning that their harassers would be less likely to engage in direct confrontation during daylight hours when their actions would be more visible and harder to deny if reported to authorities. The evacuation became a desperate 12-mile hike through mountain terrain, while carrying camping gear and trying to maintain the composure necessary to keep 3 frightened children moving towards safety. The family's tormentors continued to follow them throughout the morning, maintaining just enough distance to avoid direct confrontation while making it clear that they were still being observed and tracked. The psychological pressure of knowing they were being pursued through the wilderness transformed what should have been a manageable hike into a desperate flight from predators who seemed to view the remote forest as their personal hunting ground. The most disturbing aspect of their escape was the realization that their pursuers were toying with them rather than simply following. Several times during the hike, family members spotted individuals positioned ahead of them on the trail, suggesting that their harassers knew the area well enough to predict their route and move through the forest faster than people following established paths. The pursuers weren't just following. They were demonstrating complete control over the situation and making it clear that the Henderson family's escape was only possible because they were allowing it. The family finally reached their vehicle in the early afternoon, exhausted and traumatized, but physically unharmed. Their immediate report to park rangers and local law enforcement initiated an investigation of the area where they had been camping. But no trace of their harassers was found. The rangers took the report seriously and increased patrols in the remote area. But no arrests were made, and no similar incidents were reported by other campers in the following weeks. The official investigation concluded that the Henderson family had likely encountered local individuals who were using remote areas of the national forest for illegal activities and viewed campers as potential threats to their operations. What makes this case particularly disturbing is not just the systematic nature of the harassment, but the complete impunity with which it was carried out against a family with 3 young children. The individuals who terrorized the Henderson family demonstrated intimate knowledge of the local terrain, suggesting they were either locals who knew the area well or people who had been operating in the region for extended periods. The coordination and persistence of their harassment suggested experience in psychological intimidation, raising questions about whether this was an isolated incident or part of a pattern of predatory behavior, targeting vulnerable families in remote areas. The psychological impact on the Henderson children was profound and lasting. Emma, the youngest, required months of counseling to overcome the trauma of the experience and still refuses to participate in family camping trips. David and Sarah both reported difficulty sleeping for weeks afterward, with nightmares involving being pursued through dark forests by unseen attackers. The family's relationship with wilderness recreation was permanently altered. They now camp only in developed campgrounds, with established security and nearby ranger stations, having lost the sense of safety and peace that had drawn them to remote areas in the first place. Michael and Jennifer struggled with guilt over exposing their children to such trauma, questioning whether their love of backcountry camping had placed their family in unnecessary danger. The experience challenged their fundamental assumptions about wilderness safety and the types of threats that families might encounter in remote natural areas. They had prepared for wildlife encounters, weather emergencies, and equipment failures, but had never imagined that they might need to defend their children from systematic psychological warfare conducted by other humans in what they had always considered a safe and peaceful environment. The case highlights a reality that many outdoor enthusiasts prefer not to acknowledge. Remote wilderness areas can provide perfect cover for individuals who view isolated campers as easy targets for harassment, intimidation, or worse. The very isolation that makes backcountry camping appealing also makes campers completely dependent on the goodwill of anyone they encounter. When that goodwill is absent, when families encounter individuals who view remote areas as places where normal social rules don't apply, the result can be psychological terror that transforms peaceful natural settings into landscapes of fear and vulnerability. In Colorado's Rocky Mountains, the Henderson family learned that the greatest danger in the wilderness isn't always the mountain environment itself. Sometimes it's people who treat remote areas as hunting grounds, where they can terrorize victims with complete impunity. Their story serves as a sobering reminder that when families venture far enough from civilization to find true solitude, they enter a realm where their safety depends entirely on the intentions of anyone else who might be sharing that isolated space with them. The mountains that had promised them peace and family bonding instead became the setting for a nightmare that would haunt them for years, demonstrating that sometimes the most beautiful and remote places on Earth can hide the darkest aspects of human nature. Let's move to our seventh story. High above the treacherous slopes and windswept ridges of Mount Everest, where the mountain itself becomes both graveyard and monument to human ambition, two British climbers embarked on what would become mountaineering's greatest mystery and most haunting tale of disappearance. This is the story of George Mallory and Andrew Irvine, whose 1924 attempt to reach the summit of the world's highest peak ended in their vanishing into the thin air and swirling snow of the death zone, leaving behind a question that would obsess generations of climbers and historians. Did they reach the summit of Everest 29 years before Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay received credit for the first successful ascent? George Lee Mallory was already a legendary figure in British mountaineering circles when he joined the 1924 British Everest expedition. At 37, he was a veteran of two previous Everest expeditions and had established himself as one of the most skilled and daring climbers of his generation. Mallory possessed an almost mystical relationship with mountains, famously responding to the question of why he wanted to climb Everest with the immortal words, "Because it's there." His climbing partner, Andrew Irvine, was 22 years old and had been selected for the expedition despite his relative inexperience with high-altitude climbing. What Irvine lacked in mountaineering credentials, he made up for with exceptional physical fitness, mechanical aptitude with the experimental oxygen equipment the team was using, and an enthusiasm for extreme challenges that impressed even seasoned climbers like Mallory. The 1924 British Everest expedition was the third major attempt by British climbers to reach the summit of Mount Everest, following unsuccessful expeditions in 1921 and 1922. The team was led by Lieutenant Colonel Edward Norton and included some of the most experienced high-altitude climbers in the world, along with cutting-edge equipment and supplies that represented the pinnacle of 1920s mountaineering technology. The expedition carried experimental oxygen breathing apparatus, advanced photographic equipment to document their achievements, and detailed scientific instruments to study the effects of extreme altitude on human physiology. Most importantly, they carried the accumulated knowledge and experience of the previous expeditions, giving them the best possible chance of finally conquering the mountain that had already claimed several lives and defeated numerous attempts. The climbing strategy for the 1924 expedition involved establishing a series of camps at progressively higher altitudes, allowing team members to acclimatize gradually to the thin air and extreme conditions near Everest's summit. The plan called for multiple summit attempts by different climbing pairs, with each team building on the progress and experience of the previous attempts. Mallory and Irvine were designated as the second summit team, following an initial attempt by Norton and another climber that had reached a record altitude of 28,126 feet before being forced to turn back due to exhaustion and deteriorating weather conditions. On June 6, 1924, Mallory and Irvine began their summit attempt from advanced base camp, carrying experimental oxygen equipment that was supposed to give them a crucial advantage in the death zone above 26,000 feet. The oxygen apparatus was revolutionary for its time, but also notoriously unreliable, prone to mechanical failures that could leave climbers suddenly gasping for breath in an environment where every breath was already a struggle for survival. Irvine had spent considerable time modifying and improving the oxygen sets, using his mechanical skills to address some of the design flaws that had plagued earlier versions of the equipment. The last confirmed sighting of Mallory and Irvine alive came on the morning of June 8, 1924, when team member Noel Odell spotted two small figures high on Everest's northeast ridge, apparently making good progress toward the summit. Odell's observation, made through binoculars from a lower camp, showed the two climbers successfully navigating what appeared to be the second step, a nearly vertical rock face that represents one of the most technical climbing challenges on the route to Everest's summit. The sighting gave expedition members hope that Mallory and Irvine might actually achieve their goal of becoming the first humans to stand atop the world's highest mountain. However, Odell's sighting would also be the last time anyone saw Mallory and Irvine alive. The two climbers were expected to return to their high camp by evening on June 8th, but they never appeared. As hours passed without any sign of the missing climbers, their teammates began to realize that something had gone terribly wrong high on the mountain. The weather conditions on June 8th had been relatively good during the morning hours when Odell spotted the climbers. But afternoon brought the kind of sudden weather deterioration that is common in the Himalayan death zone, with violent winds and blowing snow that can reduce visibility to zero within minutes. The search for Mallory and Irvine began immediately, despite the extreme danger that rescue attempts posed to other expedition members. Odell himself climbed to over 27,000 feet in an attempt to locate the missing men, reaching altitudes that pushed the limits of human survival without supplemental oxygen. Other team members searched lower on the mountain, hoping to find signs that the missing climbers had descended safely but become lost or injured during their return journey. Despite heroic efforts by multiple expedition members, no trace of Mallory and Irvine was found, and the deteriorating weather conditions eventually forced the expedition to abandon their search and retreat to safer altitudes. The disappearance of Mallory and Irvine created one of mountaineering's greatest mysteries and sparked decades of speculation about what had happened during their final hours on Everest. The fact that they had been seen making progress toward the summit raised the tantalizing possibility that they might have actually reached the top of the mountain before meeting their fate during the descent. If true, this would mean that Everest had been conquered 29 years before Hillary and Tenzing's celebrated 1953 ascent, fundamentally rewriting the history of mountaineering achievement and human exploration. The mystery deepened over subsequent decades as various expeditions found tantalizing clues about the fate of the missing climbers. In 1933, a British expedition discovered an ice axe belonging to either Mallory or Irvine at approximately 27,760 feet on the northeast ridge, suggesting that at least one of the climbers had reached that elevation before something went wrong. The location of the ice axe provided crucial evidence about the route the climbers had taken and the approximate area where they had encountered fatal difficulties. But it raised as many questions as it answered about the specific circumstances of their deaths. More clues emerged in 1975 when a Chinese climber named Wang Hongbao reported finding the body of an English dead at approximately 27,000 feet during a Chinese expedition to Everest. Wang's description of the body, dressed in old-fashioned clothing and naturally mummified by the extreme cold and dry conditions, suggested that he had discovered either Mallory or Irvine. However, Wang was killed in an avalanche the day after making his report, before he could provide detailed information about the exact location of his discovery or lead other climbers to the site. The breakthrough in solving at least part of the Mallory-Irvine mystery came in 1999, when an American expedition specifically organized to search for the missing British climbers succeeded in locating Mallory's body at 26,760 feet on Everest's north face. The discovery was both triumphant and heartbreaking, providing concrete evidence of Mallory's fate while revealing the brutal reality of what had happened during his final moments on the mountain. Mallory's body was remarkably well preserved by the extreme conditions, allowing investigators to examine physical evidence that had remained frozen for 75 years. The condition of Mallory's body told a tragic story of his final struggle for survival in the death zone. He had suffered a severe head injury, likely from a fall, and had broken several ribs that would have made breathing extremely difficult at high altitude. Most tellingly, a climbing rope around his waist had been severed, suggesting that he and Irvine had been roped together when one or both of them fell, and that the rope had either broken under the strain or been cut to prevent both climbers from being pulled to their deaths. The evidence suggested that Mallory had survived his initial fall, but had been too severely injured to continue climbing or descending, eventually succumbing to his injuries and the extreme conditions. The discovery of Mallory's body answered some questions about the 1924 expedition, but raised others that may never be resolved. Most significantly, Mallory was not carrying the camera that the expedition had given him to photograph their successful summit attempt, leading to speculation that the camera might still be with Irvine's body, potentially containing photographic proof of whether the two climbers had reached Everest's summit. The absence of the camera from Mallory's body suggests that it was either lost during their climb, left at the summit as planned, or remains with Irvine's still undiscovered remains somewhere high on the mountain. Irvine's body has never been found, despite numerous subsequent expeditions that have searched for the young climber's remains. The failure to locate Irvine has fueled continued speculation about his fate, and whether he might have been carrying crucial evidence about the expedition's ultimate success or failure. Some theories suggest that Irvine's body lies in an area of the mountain that is either inaccessible to searchers or hidden beneath decades of accumulated snow and ice. Others propose that Irvine might have survived longer than Mallory and attempted to descend the mountain alone, potentially dying in a location far from where searchers have focused their efforts. The technical analysis of the route that Mallory and Irvine were attempting has provided additional insights into their likelihood of reaching the summit before their deaths. Modern climbers familiar with the Northeast Ridge route have debated whether the two British climbers possessed the technical skills and equipment necessary to overcome the formidable obstacles between their last confirmed position and Everest's summit. The second step, in particular, presents a nearly vertical rock wall that challenges even contemporary climbers using modern equipment and techniques, raising questions about whether Mallory and Irvine could have surmounted this obstacle using 1920s climbing gear. However, other evidence suggests that the two climbers were making better progress than many experts had believed possible. The location where Mallory's body was found indicates that the team had reached a higher altitude than previously thought, and the fact that they were apparently descending when they met their fate suggests that they might have completed their summit attempt before encountering the fatal difficulties that ended their lives. The debate over whether Mallory and Irvine reached Everest's summit has become one of mountaineering's most enduring controversies, with passionate advocates on both sides of the question. The psychological impact of the Mallory-Irvine mystery extends far beyond technical questions about mountaineering achievement. Their story has become a powerful symbol of human ambition and the ultimate price that explorers sometimes pay for pushing the boundaries of what is possible. The image of two climbers disappearing into the swirling snow and clouds near the top of the world's highest mountain captures something fundamental about the relationship between human beings and the natural forces that ultimately govern our fate. The 1924 expedition also represents a specific moment in history when British society was grappling with the aftermath of World War I and searching for new forms of heroism and national achievement. Mallory, who had served as an officer during the war, embodied the kind of gentleman adventurer who represented British ideals of courage, determination, and proper conduct, even in the face of certain death. His famous response to questions about why he wanted to climb Everest reflected a philosophy that valued the pursuit of seemingly impossible goals for their own sake, regardless of practical benefits or personal safety. The technological aspects of the 1924 expedition highlight how mountaineering has evolved over the subsequent century. The oxygen equipment that Mallory and Irvine carried was revolutionary for its time, but primitive compared to modern breathing apparatus, weighing nearly 30 pounds and requiring constant mechanical adjustment to function properly. Their clothing consisted of wool and cotton garments that provided minimal protection against the extreme cold and wind of the death zone. Unlike the specialized synthetic materials and insulation systems available to contemporary climbers, even their climbing equipment, hemp ropes, leather boots, and basic ice axes, would be considered dangerously inadequate by modern standards. Despite these technological limitations, Mallory and Irvine achieved altitudes and climbing performance that impressed even modern mountaineers familiar with Everest's challenges. Their ability to reach such extreme elevations using primitive equipment testifies to their exceptional physical conditioning, technical climbing skills, and psychological determination. The fact that they were apparently making good progress toward the summit when last seen suggests that human factors, skill, courage, and determination, can sometimes overcome technological disadvantages in extreme environments. The continuing search for evidence about Mallory and Irvine's ultimate fate reflects humanity's deep need to understand what happens when people push themselves to the absolute limits of human endurance and capability. Their story raises fundamental questions about the value of exploration and achievement when the costs are measured in human lives. The fact that they disappeared just short of their goal, leaving behind a mystery that has captivated people for nearly a century, makes their story more compelling than if they had simply succeeded and returned safely to tell their tale. The legacy of the 1924 British Everest expedition extends beyond the specific question of whether Mallory and Irvine reached the summit. Their attempt inspired subsequent generations of climbers and explorers, contributing to the eventual successful ascent of Everest in 1953 and the ongoing human exploration of extreme environments from the deepest oceans to outer space. The courage and determination they displayed in the face of almost certain death continues to serve as an example of human potential. When individuals are willing to risk everything in pursuit of seemingly impossible goals. In the death zone of Mount Everest, where the mountain claims lives with casual indifference and preserves the evidence of human ambition in ice and snow, George Mallory and Andrew Irvine became part of the mountain itself. Their bodies, one found and one still missing, serve as monuments to the eternal human drive to explore, achieve, and push beyond the boundaries of what seems possible. Whether they reach the summit before their deaths may never be definitively known, but their story has become larger than any single achievement, representing the tragic beauty of human ambition when it encounters forces beyond human control. The mystery of Mallory and Irvine reminds us that some questions may be more important than their answers, and that the human drive to explore and achieve can create legends that outlast any individual life or specific accomplishment. High on Mount Everest, where the air is too thin to sustain life and the cold can kill within minutes, two climbers discovered that the mountain gives up its secrets reluctantly, if at all. Their disappearance into the clouds and snow near the roof of the world ensures that the mystery of the 1924 British Everest expedition will continue to captivate and inspire people as long as humans dream of conquering the impossible. Let's move to our 8th story. Deep within the coal-scarred mountains of West Virginia, where generations of mining have carved an intricate network of tunnels and shafts into the ancient Appalachian bedrock, the Crowley family has been disappearing one by one for over 60 years in a pattern so methodical and deliberate that local law enforcement has quietly stopped investigating new cases. This is the story of a generational curse that has claimed at least 12 family members across 4 decades, transforming the abandoned mining infrastructure of rural West Virginia into a hunting ground where someone, or something, has been systematically stalking and killing members of the same bloodline with a patience and persistence that defies rational explanation. The Crowley family had deep roots in the mountains of McDowell County, dating back to the early 1900s when Irish immigrants arrived to work the coal seams that would fuel America's industrial expansion for the next century. Like many mining families, the Crowleys lived hard lives marked by dangerous work, economic uncertainty, and the ever-present threat of cave-ins, explosions, and black lung disease that claimed miners with depressing regularity. The family patriarch, Sean Crowley, had worked the mines for 37 years before a roof collapse in 1962 left him permanently disabled and dependent on a modest pension that barely supported his wife Margaret and their 4 adult children who had remained in the area. The first disappearance occurred in September 1963, when Sean's eldest son Patrick, a 28-year-old miner following in his father's footsteps, failed to return home after his shift at the Consolidation Coal Company's mine complex near Welch. Patrick's disappearance initially attracted little attention from authorities, who assumed he had simply abandoned his family and mining job for better opportunities elsewhere. A common occurrence in the economically depressed region where young men frequently left without notice to seek work in distant cities. However, Patrick's family knew that something more sinister had occurred because he had left behind his entire week's wages, his cherished hunting rifle, and detailed plans for a hunting trip with his brothers scheduled for the following weekend. The search for Patrick Crowley was hampered by the complex geography of the mining region, where thousands of abandoned mine shafts, processing facilities, and access tunnels created an underground maze that stretched for hundreds of miles beneath the mountains. Local search teams focused their efforts on the active mining areas where Patrick had last been seen. But the abandoned portions of the mine complex were considered too dangerous to search thoroughly due to unstable roof conditions, toxic gases, and the constant risk of cave-ins that could trap or kill rescue workers. After 3 weeks of searching without finding any trace of Patrick, the official investigation was quietly suspended and the case was classified as a voluntary missing person situation. The second disappearance came 18 months later, when Patrick's younger brother Michael vanished under almost identical circumstances. Michael, 25, had been working the night shift at a different mine in the same complex when he disappeared sometime between leaving work at 6 a.m. and his expected arrival home at 7 a.m. His car was found parked at a roadside diner halfway between the mine and his house, with his wallet, keys, and mining equipment still inside. But no signs of struggle or indication of where he might have gone. The timing and circumstances of Michael's disappearance were so similar to Patrick's that even skeptical local authorities began to suspect that the Crowley family was being targeted by someone with intimate knowledge of their routines and habits. The pattern became unmistakable in 1967, when Sean Crowley's daughter Catherine disappeared while walking home from her job at the company store in downtown Welch. Catherine, 23, and recently married, had followed the same route home every evening for 2 years without incident. But on March 15th, she simply vanished during the half-mile walk between the store and her house. Her purse was found the next morning beside an abandoned mine entrance, but there was no other evidence to suggest what had happened to her or who might have been responsible for her disappearance. The discovery location was particularly ominous because the mine entrance led to a section of tunnels that had been sealed since the 1940s due to a series of fatal accidents. As news of the disappearances spread through the tight-knit mining community, a disturbing pattern emerged from conversations with other families in the region. Several people reported seeing Crowley family members in the company of an unidentified man during the days or weeks before their disappearances. The man was described consistently as middle-aged, wearing mining clothes, and possessing an intimate knowledge of local mining operations and family histories. However, no one could identify him as a current or former employee of any of the mining companies operating in the area. And his apparent familiarity with families and locations suggested someone who had been observing the community for an extended period. The most chilling aspect of these witness accounts was that the mysterious man seemed to appear only in connection with the Crowley family, as if he was specifically targeting them rather than opportunistically preying on vulnerable individuals throughout the community. Several witnesses reported seeing him engaged in friendly conversation with Crowley family members, suggesting that they trusted him and had no reason to fear his presence. This pattern indicated that whoever was responsible for the disappearances was skilled at gaining the confidence of his victims and patient enough to establish relationships before striking. The Pakilobal's fourth disappearance occurred in 1969, when Sean's youngest son Thomas, only 19 years old, vanished while hunting in the mountains near several abandoned mine sites. Thomas had been an experienced outdoorsman who knew the local terrain intimately, making it unlikely that he had simply gotten lost or suffered an accident in familiar territory. His hunting rifle was found 3 days later in a mine shaft, approximately 5 miles from where he had last been seen. But there was no sign of Thomas himself or any evidence to explain how his weapon had ended up in such a remote location. The deliberate placement of the rifle in an abandoned mine suggested that whoever was responsible for the disappearances was using the extensive underground infrastructure as both a hunting ground and a disposal site. By 1970, the Crowley family had lost 4 members to unexplained disappearances, and the remaining family members were living in a state of constant terror. Sean Crowley, now confined to a wheelchair and suffering from advanced black lung disease, became convinced that his family was the victim of a deliberate campaign of persecution connected to some unknown incident from his mining career. He spent his final months obsessively reviewing company records, union documents, and local newspaper archives, searching for clues about who might harbor such intense hatred for his family that they would systematically murder his children over a period of years. Sean's desperate research uncovered references to a mining accident in 1943 that had killed 7 workers in a section of the mine where Sean had worked as a young man. The accident had been caused by faulty safety equipment and poor ventilation, but the company had covered up the true causes and blamed the deaths on worker negligence to avoid liability. Sean discovered that he had been one of only 3 workers who possessed detailed knowledge of the safety violations that had led to the accident, and that he had been pressured by company officials to remain silent about what he had witnessed in exchange for continued employment and eventual supervisory positions. The implications of Sean's research were terrifying. If someone connected to the 1943 mining accident was responsible for targeting his family, it suggested a level of patience and methodical planning that spanned decades. The systematic nature of the disappearances, the intimate knowledge of family routines, and the consistent use of abandoned mining infrastructure all pointed to someone with deep connections to the local mining industry and a personal grudge that had been festering for nearly 30 years. Sean Crowley died in 1971 without ever learning the identity of his family's tormentor. But the disappearances continued with clockwork regularity. His widow, Margaret, vanished in 1973 while visiting Catherine's grave in the local cemetery. Her car was found running with the door open beside a mine entrance that had been sealed for decades, but recent excavations suggested that someone had been using the site regularly. Margaret's disappearance was particularly disturbing because she had been under informal police protection and had avoided leaving her house alone for months before her death. The pattern continued into the second generation as the children and grandchildren of the original victims began reaching adulthood. In 1978, Patrick's son Kevin disappeared while working as a security guard at one of the few remaining active mines in the area. His uniform and equipment were found arranged in a ritualistic pattern at the entrance to an abandoned shaft, suggesting that the disappearances had evolved from simple murders into something more elaborate and ceremonial. The symbolic nature of Kevin's disappearance indicated that whoever was responsible had developed an increasingly complex relationship with their crimes over the 15 years since the killings had begun. The most recent confirmed disappearance occurred in 1981, when Michael's daughter Jennifer, 21, vanished while attending a community college in Charleston, 2 hours away from the family's traditional mining community. The fact that the killer had tracked Jennifer to a distant city and successfully abducted her without leaving evidence suggested sophisticated planning and resources that went far beyond the capabilities of a single disturbed individual. Jennifer's disappearance also marked a geographic expansion of the threat, indicating that distance from the mining region would not provide safety for surviving Crowley family members. Local law enforcement's response to the Crowley disappearances evolved from active investigation to resigned acceptance over the nearly 2 decades during which the crimes occurred. Early cases received thorough attention from county sheriff's deputies and state police investigators. But as the pattern became established and no arrests were made, official interest waned and resources were redirected to cases that seemed more solvable. By the late 1970s, Crowley family disappearances were processed as routine paperwork rather than urgent criminal investigations, with investigators privately acknowledging that they had no realistic hope of identifying or apprehending the perpetrator. The unofficial law enforcement consensus was that the Crowley killings were the work of someone with intimate knowledge of local geography, mining operations, and family histories. Possibly a current or former mine employee who had been planning and executing the murders for decades. However, the complete absence of physical evidence, witnesses, or mistakes by the perpetrator suggested a level of criminal sophistication that seemed inconsistent with the profile of a typical mining community resident. The methodical nature of the crimes and the long-term planning involved indicated someone with patience and resources that transcended normal criminal motivations. The psychological impact on surviving Crowley family members was devastating and long-lasting. Those who remained in the area lived in constant fear, altering their daily routines, avoiding isolated locations, and maintaining informal buddy systems to reduce their vulnerability to attack. Several family members relocated to distant states. But Jennifer's disappearance in Charleston demonstrated that geographic distance provided no guaranteed protection from whoever was hunting them. The knowledge that they were being systematically stalked by an unknown enemy created a psychological atmosphere of helplessness and paranoia that poisoned every aspect of their lives. The broader mining community was also affected by the Crowley disappearances, as residents realized that if such systematic persecution could be conducted against one family with complete impunity, no one was truly safe from similar attacks. The crimes contributed to the already declining population of the region, as families chose to relocate rather than risk becoming the next target of violence, and they had no means of preventing or understanding. The abandoned mine shafts and processing facilities that had once represented economic opportunity became symbols of hidden danger and unresolved evil. Modern analysis of the Crowley case by criminal profilers and forensic psychologists has identified several characteristics that make it unique among documented serial killing cases. The multi-generational scope of the crimes suggests either an individual with extraordinary longevity and patience, or a conspiracy involving multiple perpetrators operating over decades. The consistent methodology and symbolic elements indicate someone with deep psychological investment in the crimes rather than opportunistic violence. Most unusually, the complete absence of bodies or definitive physical evidence suggests disposal methods and operational security measures that exceed the capabilities typically associated with rural criminals. The case has attracted attention from researchers studying unsolved disappearances in former mining regions, as similar patterns of unexplained vanishings have been documented in other areas where extensive underground infrastructure provides opportunities for concealment and disposal of evidence. The combination of economic desperation, social isolation, and geographic complexity that characterizes mining communities creates conditions where systematic predatory behavior can continue for extended periods without detection or interruption. Contemporary law enforcement agencies have reopened several Crowley-related cases using modern investigative techniques. But the passage of time and environmental degradation of potential crime scenes have made significant progress unlikely. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of suspected disposal sites have revealed numerous anomalies consistent with buried remains. But the dangerous conditions in abandoned mines have prevented comprehensive excavation and recovery efforts. DNA analysis of available evidence has been hampered by the age and condition of physical materials. Though ongoing technological advances may eventually provide new investigative opportunities, the Crowley family disappearances represent one of the most persistent and methodical campaigns of targeted violence in American criminal history, spanning multiple decades and claiming victims across 2 generations, while leaving virtually no actionable evidence for law enforcement. The use of abandoned mining infrastructure as both hunting ground and disposal site created perfect conditions for concealment and operational security, while the economic and social isolation of the victims reduced the likelihood of effective investigation or intervention. What makes the case particularly disturbing is not just the systematic nature of the violence, but the apparent personal motivation that sustained the perpetrator's activities over such an extended period. The patience required to track and eliminate family members across decades suggests a level of psychological investment that transcends normal criminal behavior, indicating someone for whom the destruction of the Crowley family had become a life's work rather than simply a series of opportunistic crimes. In the coal-scarred mountains of West Virginia, where abandoned mines serve as monuments to industrial exploitation and economic collapse, the Crowley family discovered that some grudges can outlast the individuals who created them, passing from generation to generation like a hereditary curse that cannot be escaped through distance, time, or prayer. Their story serves as a chilling reminder that in isolated communities where law enforcement resources are limited and geographic conditions favor concealment, systematic predatory behavior can continue for decades, while authorities struggle helplessly to protect victims they cannot identify until it is already too late. The empty houses and unmarked graves scattered throughout McDowell County stand as testimony to the Crowley family's tragedy, while the abandoned mine shafts that honeycomb the mountains beneath continue to guard their secrets with the patience of geological time. Somewhere in those dark tunnels, the evidence of a multi-generational campaign of murder remains hidden, waiting for the day when advancing technology or pure chance will finally reveal the truth about who spent decades systematically destroying a single family with the methodical precision of an industrial process designed to eliminate human beings as efficiently as coal mining equipment once extracted fossil fuels from the same Appalachian bedrock. Let's move to our ninth story. Deep in the remote wilderness of Tennessee's Cumberland Mountains, where ancient hiking trails wind through dense forests that have remained virtually unchanged for centuries, solo backpacker Marcus Reed discovered that the greatest horror in the mountains isn't always what you can see. Sometimes it's what systematically disappears from your pack while you sleep, leaving you increasingly vulnerable with each passing night until you realize that something or someone has been deliberately sabotaging your survival while stalking you through the wilderness with methodical patience. This is the documented account of Reed's 7-day nightmare in September 2016, when what began as a peaceful solo hiking expedition became a deadly game of psychological warfare conducted by an unknown predator who seemed to understand exactly how to strip away a human being's ability to survive in the wilderness while maximizing their terror and desperation. Marcus Reed was a 34-year-old software engineer from Nashville who had been solo backpacking throughout Tennessee's mountain regions for over 12 years without ever experiencing anything more threatening than occasional encounters with black bears and the typical challenges of navigating difficult terrain in unpredictable weather. Reed wasn't a weekend warrior seeking Instagram-worthy adventures. He was a meticulous planner who researched his routes extensively, carried comprehensive safety equipment, and followed established protocols for solo wilderness travel that had kept him safe during hundreds of previous trips into remote areas throughout the southeastern United States. Reed's planned route for his September 2016 expedition was a challenging but familiar loop trail that would take him approximately 60 miles through some of the most isolated sections of the Cumberland Mountain Wilderness, including several days of hiking through areas that rarely saw other backpackers due to the difficult terrain and limited access points. The route was designed to provide the kind of complete solitude that Reed valued in his wilderness experiences, taking him far from established campgrounds and popular hiking destinations to areas where he could spend days without seeing another human being or any signs of modern civilization. The preparation for Reed's expedition reflected his years of experience and attention to detail. His pack contained carefully selected gear that had been tested during previous trips, including a high-quality tent rated for severe weather, a comprehensive first aid kit, water purification equipment, emergency communication devices, and enough food to sustain him for 8 days with a comfortable safety margin. Reed had filed detailed itineraries with park rangers and family members, established check-in schedules using his satellite communication device, and carried backup equipment for critical items like water purification and navigation tools. The first indication that Reed's trip would be anything but routine came on his second night, when he discovered that his water purification tablets had vanished from his pack despite being stored in a sealed container inside a zippered compartment that showed no signs of damage or tampering. Reed initially suspected that he had simply forgotten to pack the tablets or had lost them during the day's hiking. But he distinctly remembered checking the container the previous evening and confirming that it contained enough tablets for his entire planned expedition. The missing tablets forced Reed to rely entirely on his backup purification method, boiling water over his camp stove, which required additional fuel consumption and time that hadn't been factored into his expedition planning. Reed's concern about the missing purification tablets intensified when he conducted a comprehensive inventory of his equipment and discovered that several other small but crucial items had also disappeared overnight. His emergency whistle, which had been attached to his pack's shoulder strap with a secure carabiner, was missing despite the carabiner remaining in place and showing no signs of having been opened. A spare headlamp that had been stored in an internal pack pocket was gone, along with the batteries that had been stored separately in a different compartment. Most troubling was the disappearance of his detailed topographic maps, which had been stored in a waterproof case inside his pack and were essential for navigation in the complex terrain he was traversing. The systematic nature of the thefts was immediately apparent to Reed, who realized that whoever had entered his pack had deliberately selected items that were crucial for safety and navigation, while leaving behind more obvious targets like his wallet, credit cards, and expensive camera equipment. The thief wasn't motivated by monetary gain, but rather seemed intent on undermining Reed's ability to survive safely in the wilderness. The precision of the theft, taking only items that would create specific survival challenges while leaving everything else undisturbed, suggested someone with extensive knowledge of wilderness survival and the psychology of fear. Reed's attempts to understand how someone could have accessed his pack without waking him revealed the sophisticated nature of the harassment he was facing. His tent had been secured according to established protocols, with all zippers closed and his pack stored inside the tent's vestibule where any tampering should have been audible. The tent fabric showed no signs of cutting or damage, and the ground around his campsite bore no footprints or other evidence of human presence. Most disturbing was Reed's growing realization that he had been drugged. He had slept far more deeply than usual and awakened feeling groggy and disoriented, symptoms that were inconsistent with normal camping fatigue. The psychological impact of realizing that an unknown individual had been inside his tent while he slept, manipulating his equipment and potentially administering drugs without his knowledge, was profound and immediate. Reed's sense of security in the wilderness, built up over years of successful solo hiking, was completely shattered by the knowledge that his most basic assumptions about safety and privacy had been violated. The isolation that he had always valued as peaceful solitude now felt like dangerous vulnerability, as he realized that he was completely dependent on the goodwill of whoever was stalking him. Reed faced a critical decision about whether to abandon his planned route and attempt to reach safety immediately, or continue his expedition while implementing enhanced security measures. His rational mind told him to evacuate the area as quickly as possible, but his planned exit route would require 2 days of difficult hiking through terrain, where he would be even more vulnerable to harassment or attack. Additionally, his sabotaged equipment, particularly the missing maps and navigation tools, made it dangerous to attempt unfamiliar routes or shortcuts that might normally provide faster evacuation options. Reed decided to continue his planned route while taking extreme precautions to protect his remaining equipment and detect any further intrusions. He rigged improvised alarm systems using fishing line and small bells around his campsite perimeter, moved his most critical equipment inside his sleeping bag, where tampering would be more likely to wake him, and established a detailed inventory system to quickly identify any additional thefts. Most importantly, he began taking photographs of his equipment arrangements each evening and morning to create evidence of any tampering that occurred during the night. The third night brought an escalation in the harassment that confirmed Reed's worst fears about his situation. Despite his enhanced security measures, his stalker managed to enter his campsite and steal additional equipment, while leaving behind clear evidence that the intrusions were deliberate rather than opportunistic. Reed's backup water filter had been disassembled and the critical ceramic element removed, rendering the device useless but leaving the obvious outer components to create the illusion that nothing had been disturbed. His camp stove fuel canister had been partially drained, leaving enough fuel to operate normally for cooking dinner, but insufficient for the extended use that would be required if he needed to purify water by boiling throughout the remainder of his trip. Most chilling was the discovery that his stalker had rearranged items inside his pack in ways that were clearly intended to send psychological messages rather than simply steal equipment. Reed's first aid supplies had been sorted and arranged in neat rows inside his pack, as if someone had been taking inventory of his medical capabilities. His food supplies had been examined and repackaged, with several items showing small bite marks that suggested his stalker had been sampling his provisions. The violation of his personal space and the intimate knowledge of his equipment that these actions demonstrated created a level of psychological pressure that was almost unbearable. The pattern of escalating harassment continued throughout Reed's fourth and fifth days in the wilderness, with each night bringing new thefts and psychological warfare designed to increase his desperation and reduce his ability to survive independently. His compass was stolen and replaced with a similar-looking but non-functional replica that would have led him dangerously off course if he hadn't detected the substitution during his morning equipment check. His sleeping bag was contaminated with an unknown substance that caused severe skin irritation, forcing him to sleep directly on the ground in increasingly cold nighttime temperatures. His remaining food supplies were systematically poisoned with substances that caused stomach cramps and nausea, leaving him weakened and unable to maintain the physical stamina required for challenging mountain hiking. The most terrifying aspect of Reed's ordeal was the growing realization that his stalker possessed intimate knowledge of his planned route and was using that information to establish ambush points and supply caches throughout the wilderness area. Several times during his daily hiking, Reed discovered evidence that someone had been waiting for him at specific locations: trampled vegetation where someone had been lying in concealment, discarded food wrappers from the same brands that had been stolen from his pack, and even his own stolen equipment arranged in deliberate patterns that served as psychological markers to let him know he was being watched and tracked. The harassment took on an increasingly sadistic quality as Reed's physical and mental condition deteriorated from the combined effects of equipment sabotage, food poisoning, and psychological pressure. His stolen headlamp was returned to his pack, but modified with a switch that would cause it to fail after a few minutes of operation, creating dangerous situations when he needed reliable lighting for navigation or emergency situations. His water bottles were repeatedly contaminated with substances that caused diarrhea and dehydration, forcing him to expend increasing amounts of time and fuel purifying water while becoming progressively weaker from fluid loss and nutritional deficiency. By his sixth day in the wilderness, Reed was experiencing the kind of desperation that drives people to make fatal mistakes in wilderness environments. His compromised equipment had forced him to travel much slower than planned, extending his time in the area where he was vulnerable to continued harassment. His depleted food supplies and persistent stomach problems had left him weak and unable to think clearly about navigation and safety decisions. Most dangerously, his deteriorating psychological state was causing him to second-guess his own perceptions and memories, making it difficult to distinguish between real threats and paranoid imaginings brought on by stress and exhaustion. The crisis point came on Reed's sixth night, when his stalker escalated from theft and sabotage to direct physical threat. Reed awakened to find that his tent had been surrounded by a circle of his own stolen equipment, arranged in a ritualistic pattern that clearly indicated his tormentor's ability to approach his campsite without detection. More frightening was the discovery of a note written on paper torn from his own journal, containing detailed personal information about his family, his home address, and his work schedule that could only have been obtained through extended surveillance of his life outside the wilderness. The note made it clear that the harassment would continue even after Reed returned to civilization unless he followed specific instructions that would place him in even greater danger. The realization that his stalker had been researching his personal life and planning an extended campaign of persecution that would continue beyond his current wilderness expedition finally pushed Reed to abandon his planned route and attempt an emergency evacuation despite the risks involved. Using his satellite communication device, he transmitted a distress signal and attempted to guide rescue teams to his location, but discovered that his GPS coordinates had been deliberately altered by someone with access to the device while he slept. The false coordinates led rescue teams to search areas miles from his actual location, delaying assistance and forcing Reed to attempt self-rescue through unfamiliar terrain while his condition continued to deteriorate. Reed's escape from his 7-day nightmare required him to abandon most of his remaining equipment and attempt a dangerous night hike through terrain he hadn't scouted. Guided only by his compromised navigation tools and growing desperation to reach safety before his stalker could complete whatever final act of violence had been planned. The hike became a desperate flight through darkness, with Reed using his last remaining functional flashlight to navigate treacherous mountain paths, while expecting at any moment to encounter his tormentor waiting in ambush ahead. The most disturbing aspect of Reed's eventual escape was the realization that he had been allowed to leave. Several times during his desperate night hike, he spotted lights in the forest that appeared to be pacing his movement. And he discovered evidence the next morning that someone had been clearing obstacles from his path and marking the correct route with subtle indicators that had helped him avoid dangerous wrong turns. His stalker had apparently decided that the psychological torture was complete and was now facilitating Reed's escape, suggesting a level of control and manipulation that went far beyond simple harassment. Reed finally reached a Forest Service road on his 7th day and was eventually picked up by search and rescue teams who had been looking for him based on his overdue status and distress signals. His physical condition required immediate medical attention for dehydration, malnutrition, and exposure-related injuries. But his psychological trauma was far more severe and long-lasting. The systematic nature of his harassment and the intimate personal information his stalker had possessed created a persistent paranoia that affected every aspect of his life for months afterward. The official investigation into Reed's harassment revealed the sophisticated nature of the operation that had been conducted against him. Analysis of his equipment showed evidence of tampering that required specialized tools and knowledge, suggesting that his stalker had extensive experience with outdoor gear and survival techniques. The substances used to contaminate his food and water were identified as compounds that would cause specific symptoms without creating permanent injury, indicating someone with chemistry or pharmacology background who had carefully calculated dosages to maximize psychological impact while avoiding fatal poisoning. Most troubling was the discovery that Reed's harassment appeared to be part of a larger pattern of similar incidents affecting solo hikers throughout the southeastern mountain regions. Law enforcement agencies had received reports of equipment theft, food contamination, and psychological harassment from multiple victims over a period of several years. But the incidents had been classified as isolated pranks or vandalism, rather than elements of a coordinated campaign. The sophisticated nature of the operations and the consistent methodology suggested the work of an individual or group with extensive resources and wilderness expertise who had been conducting systematic psychological experiments on vulnerable hikers. The investigation also revealed that Reed's stalker had been monitoring his social media accounts, hiking forum posts, and online activity for months before his September expedition, gathering information about his planned routes, equipment preferences, and personal background that had been used to customize the harassment campaign for maximum psychological impact. The level of preparation and surveillance involved indicated that Reed had been specifically targeted rather than randomly selected, though the criteria used for victim selection remained unclear. Reed's experience highlighted the vulnerability of solo hikers in remote wilderness areas, where the isolation that provides peace and solitude also creates perfect conditions for predatory behavior. The complex terrain and limited law enforcement presence in remote mountain regions provide opportunities for sophisticated criminals to operate with near impunity, while the self-reliant nature of wilderness recreation means that victims often don't seek help until their situations have become desperate. The psychological warfare techniques used against Reed demonstrated an understanding of survival psychology and fear management that suggested military or law enforcement training. The systematic removal of safety equipment, contamination of food and water supplies, and escalating psychological pressure followed patterns designed to break down mental resistance and create maximum terror while maintaining plausible deniability. The precision of the attacks and the sophistication of the surveillance operation indicated a level of criminal organization that exceeded typical opportunistic wilderness crime. Reed never returned to solo wilderness hiking, having lost the sense of peace and safety that had originally drawn him to remote mountain areas. His experience served as a cautionary tale for other solo hikers about the potential dangers of isolation and the importance of maintaining communication with outside support networks. The knowledge that someone could systematically destroy a person's ability to survive in the wilderness while conducting detailed psychological torture created a new category of outdoor risk that few hikers had previously considered. The case remains officially unsolved, though law enforcement agencies have implemented enhanced monitoring of remote wilderness areas and improved communication protocols for solo hikers based on lessons learned from Reed's experience. The individual or group responsible for his harassment was never identified, despite extensive investigation that included surveillance of popular hiking areas and analysis of equipment purchases that might indicate someone preparing for similar operations. What makes Reed's case particularly disturbing is not just the systematic nature of the harassment, but the intimate knowledge of wilderness survival and human psychology that his stalker demonstrated throughout the 7-day ordeal. The ability to systematically strip away a person's survival capabilities while maximizing psychological trauma requires a combination of technical knowledge, wilderness expertise, and understanding of fear psychology that suggests someone with specialized training or extensive experience in breaking down human resistance. In the remote mountains of Tennessee, where ancient trails wind through forests that have witnessed countless human dramas over the centuries, Marcus Reed discovered that the greatest danger in the wilderness isn't always the natural environment. Sometimes it's someone who understands exactly how to use that environment as a weapon against anyone unfortunate enough to become their target. His story serves as a chilling reminder that in isolated areas far from help, there are individuals who view other human beings as subjects for experimentation in the limits of psychological torture and survival manipulation. The equipment that was stolen from Reed's pack during those 7 nightmarish days was never recovered, presumably kept as trophies by someone who had spent months planning and executing a campaign of terror that demonstrated the terrifying vulnerability of anyone who ventures alone into the wilderness. Somewhere in Tennessee's Cumberland Mountains, the evidence of Reed's ordeal may still be hidden in a cache maintained by someone who views the systematic destruction of human beings as a form of entertainment, waiting patiently for the next solo hiker who makes the mistake of believing that they can find safety and solitude in places where predators have learned to hunt with the patience and precision of natural forces. Let's move to our 10th story. High in the Italian Alps, where the jagged peaks of Monte Marmolada pierce the sky like ancient cathedral spires and avalanche-prone slopes have claimed countless lives throughout history. December 13th, 1916, witnessed one of the most catastrophic natural disasters ever recorded in mountain warfare. This is the documented account of White Friday, when a series of massive avalanches triggered by artillery bombardment buried entire military units alive, transforming a World War I battlefield into a frozen cemetery, where between 2,000 and 10,000 soldiers were entombed in ice and snow so deep that many bodies remained undiscovered for decades, creating a haunting reminder of how quickly nature can turn human conflict into mass extinction. The disaster occurred during one of the most brutal and senseless campaigns of World War I, when Italian and Austro-Hungarian forces were locked in a deadly stalemate along the mountainous front that stretched across some of the most treacherous terrain in Europe. The war in the Alps represented a unique form of madness, where military commanders on both sides had decided to fight a conventional land war at altitudes and in conditions that made basic survival a constant struggle even without enemy action. Soldiers were expected to maintain trenches and fortifications carved into frozen mountainsides, where temperatures regularly dropped to -30 degrees Fahrenheit and blizzards could last for weeks without interruption. Monte Marmolada, rising to over 10,000 feet above sea level, had become a strategic objective for both armies, despite its obvious unsuitability for military operations. The mountain slopes were notorious for avalanche activity even during peacetime, with local populations having learned over centuries to avoid certain areas during winter months when unstable snow conditions made travel suicidal. However, military planners on both sides ignored these traditional warnings in their obsession with gaining tactical advantages over terrain that offered no meaningful strategic value beyond denying it to the enemy. The Italian forces had established a series of fortified positions on the mountain's southern slopes, including elaborate tunnel systems carved into the rock and ice that were intended to provide shelter from both enemy fire and the brutal alpine weather. These positions housed approximately 3,000 soldiers from various Italian mountain infantry units, along with artillery pieces, ammunition storage facilities, and the complex logistics infrastructure required to maintain a military presence in such extreme conditions. The Italian tunnels represented months of dangerous construction work, with soldiers using explosives and hand tools to carve living and working spaces out of the frozen mountainside. Opposing them, Austro-Hungarian forces had established similar fortifications on the northern approaches to Monte Marmolada, creating a bizarre situation where two armies were essentially fighting each other while simultaneously battling the mountain environment that was far more dangerous than either human enemy. The Austro-Hungarian positions housed approximately 2,000 soldiers, including specialized mountain troops who had been recruited from alpine regions and possessed some understanding of avalanche risks and winter survival techniques that were completely foreign to soldiers from lower elevations. The meteorological conditions leading up to December 13, 1916, created a perfect storm of factors that would make the mountain slopes catastrophically unstable. Heavy snowfall throughout November and early December had deposited enormous quantities of snow on slopes that were already overloaded from previous storms. Temperature fluctuations had created layers of ice and unstable snow conditions that formed natural avalanche triggers throughout the region. Most critically, military weather observers had noted increasing wind patterns that were redistributing snow loads in ways that made even experienced alpine soldiers nervous about the stability of their positions. Despite clear warnings from soldiers familiar with mountain conditions, military commanders on both sides continued to plan offensive operations that would require extensive use of artillery bombardment on slopes that local guides had declared suicidally dangerous. The Italian artillery plan called for a massive preliminary bombardment using heavy guns positioned at lower elevations to destroy Austro-Hungarian fortifications before a planned infantry assault. The Austro-Hungarian response plan involved counter-battery fire designed to silence Italian guns and disrupt their offensive preparations. The tragic irony of the White Friday disaster was that both armies were simultaneously implementing artillery plans that would trigger the very avalanches that their own soldiers feared. Military communications from both sides during the days leading up to December 13th included multiple warnings from junior officers and enlisted men who understood that prolonged artillery bombardment on overloaded snow slopes would inevitably trigger massive avalanches. However, these warnings were dismissed by senior commanders who prioritized tactical objectives over environmental concerns they didn't understand. The artillery bombardment began at dawn on December 13, 1916. With Italian batteries opening fire on Austro-Hungarian positions using heavy guns that had been laboriously transported to high-altitude firing positions over a period of weeks. The sound of the guns echoing through the mountain valleys was immediately followed by ominous rumbling sounds that experienced alpine soldiers recognized as the precursors to major avalanche activity. Within minutes of the first artillery rounds impacting on Monte Marmolada's slopes, massive snowslides began to break loose from multiple locations simultaneously. The first avalanche to claim significant casualties was triggered by Italian artillery fire that struck a snow cornice above Austro-Hungarian positions at approximately 0630 hours. The initial slide was relatively small, involving perhaps 50,000 cubic meters of snow and debris. But it struck the mouth of a tunnel complex where nearly 200 Austro-Hungarian soldiers were sheltering from the bombardment. The tunnel entrance was completely sealed by the avalanche debris, trapping the soldiers inside with no possibility of rescue, as additional slides continued to bury the area under increasing depths of snow and ice. The Austro-Hungarian counter-battery fire, which began approximately 30 minutes after the Italian bombardment commenced, immediately triggered even more catastrophic avalanches on slopes, where Italian forces had established their primary defensive positions. One artillery round that struck near the peak of Monte Marmolada triggered a massive slide that swept down the mountain's southern face like a frozen tsunami, carrying away entire sections of Italian fortifications, along with the soldiers manning them. Eyewitness accounts described a wall of snow and debris over 100 feet high, moving down the mountainside at speeds that made escape impossible for anyone caught in its path. The scope of the disaster became apparent as avalanches continued to trigger throughout the morning, with each new artillery impact setting off additional slides that swept away positions on both sides of the conflict. The Italian artillery observers, positioned at lower elevations where they had clear views of the mountain slopes, reported watching their own countrymen disappear beneath waves of snow and debris as their bombardment continued to trigger the very avalanches that were destroying their infantry positions. However, military communication systems had been so disrupted by the avalanche activity that commanders could not effectively coordinate the cessation of artillery fire even after the catastrophic results became obvious. The most devastating single avalanche occurred at approximately 0930 hours when a massive slide broke loose from the mountain's main snowfield and swept down multiple valleys simultaneously, carrying away Italian positions that housed nearly 1,500 soldiers along with their equipment, weapons, and fortifications. Survivors who witnessed this avalanche from safe positions described it as resembling a mountain-sized ocean wave made of snow and ice, moving so fast that it created its own weather patterns and generated winds strong enough to knock down trees and structures far beyond the actual path of the debris flow. The psychological impact on surviving soldiers was immediate and devastating, as they realized that they were witnessing the systematic destruction of their own forces by natural processes that their military commanders had triggered through ignorance and stubborn adherence to tactical plans that ignored environmental realities. Italian soldiers who survived the morning's avalanches reported watching entire companies of their comrades disappear beneath the snow, with some avalanches so large that they completely altered the topography of familiar valleys and ridgelines. The Austro-Hungarian forces suffered proportionally similar losses, with entire tunnel complexes being sealed or destroyed by avalanches triggered by their own artillery fire as well as Italian bombardment. The irony of the situation was that both armies were effectively destroying themselves through their determination to continue military operations in conditions where the environment was far more dangerous than any human enemy. The avalanches showed no discrimination between Italian and Austro-Hungarian positions, sweeping away fortifications and soldiers with equal efficiency regardless of their national allegiances. Rescue operations began immediately after the artillery fire ceased around noon on December 13th. But the scale of the disaster and the continued instability of the snow conditions made effective rescue efforts virtually impossible. Surviving soldiers from both armies found themselves digging frantically through avalanche debris using hand tools and improvised equipment, searching for buried comrades while facing the constant threat of additional slides triggered by their rescue activities. The depth of the avalanche debris in many areas exceeded 50 feet. meaning that soldiers buried in the initial slides were beyond any realistic hope of rescue, even if their exact locations could be determined. The grim mathematics of avalanche survival meant that most soldiers buried by the slides would die from suffocation within minutes, long before rescue teams could locate and excavate them from the massive debris fields. However, rescue efforts continued for days as surviving soldiers refused to abandon their buried comrades, despite the obvious futility of their efforts and the constant danger posed by unstable snow conditions that threatened to trigger additional avalanches. The dedication of soldiers who risked their own lives attempting to rescue buried comrades created some of the few heroic moments in a disaster that was otherwise characterized by command incompetence and preventable tragedy. The recovery of bodies from the White Friday avalanches continued sporadically for decades after the disaster, with human remains being discovered by mountaineers, hikers, and construction workers throughout the 20th century as changing climate conditions and glacial movement gradually exposed burial sites. The preservation of bodies in the high-altitude ice was so complete that soldiers killed in 1916 were often found in remarkably good condition decades later, still wearing their uniforms and carrying personal effects that provided moving testimony to their final moments. Some of the most disturbing discoveries were made in areas where entire military units had been buried together, creating frozen tableaux that preserved the final actions and positions of soldiers who had died simultaneously when avalanches swept through their positions. Archaeological investigations of these sites revealed that many soldiers had died while attempting to help their comrades, creating touching evidence of human solidarity in the face of overwhelming natural forces that had been triggered by human stupidity and military incompetence. The official casualty figures for White Friday have never been definitively established, largely because military record-keeping systems were completely disrupted by the disaster, and many unit rosters were buried along with the soldiers they documented. Italian military historians estimate that between 1,500 and 3,000 Italian soldiers died in the avalanches, while Austro-Hungarian records suggest losses of between 500 and 2,000 soldiers from their forces. However, these figures are acknowledged to be incomplete, and the true death toll may have exceeded 10,000 soldiers from both armies combined. The immediate military consequences of the White Friday disaster were almost as catastrophic as the human losses, as both armies lost significant portions of their alpine warfare capabilities, along with months of construction work and strategic positioning. The destruction of fortified positions and supply infrastructure effectively ended major military operations in the Monte Marmolada region for the remainder of World War I, demonstrating how natural disasters could achieve strategic objectives that neither army had been able to accomplish through conventional warfare. The psychological impact on surviving soldiers extended far beyond the immediate trauma of witnessing mass death and destruction. Many survivors reported persistent nightmares involving avalanches and snow, along with survivors' guilt over their escape from disaster that had claimed so many of their comrades. Medical records from military hospitals treating White Friday survivors documented symptoms that would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, though contemporary military medicine had no effective treatments for the psychological wounds inflicted by witnessing such massive and sudden loss of life. The disaster also had profound effects on military strategy and doctrine, as commanders throughout the European theater began to recognize that environmental factors could be more dangerous than enemy action in certain circumstances. The White Friday avalanches provided a brutal lesson in the importance of understanding and respecting natural forces when planning military operations. Though this lesson would be forgotten and relearned repeatedly throughout subsequent conflicts in mountainous regions, modern analysis of the White Friday disaster by avalanche experts and military historians has identified it as a perfect example of how human activities can trigger natural catastrophes with consequences far exceeding the original intentions. The artillery bombardment that caused the avalanches was relatively modest by World War I standards. But it occurred at precisely the moment when snow conditions were most unstable, creating a cascade effect that transformed routine military operations into mass extinction events. The meteorological factors that contributed to the disaster have been studied extensively by avalanche researchers seeking to understand how military activities might interact with natural hazards in mountainous regions. The combination of heavy snowfall, temperature fluctuations, and wind patterns that created the unstable conditions on Monte Marmolada in December 1916 represents a textbook example of avalanche-prone conditions that should have precluded any military activities involving explosives or heavy equipment. The White Friday disaster has also become a case study in organizational failure and the dangers of ignoring expert warnings when pursuing institutional objectives. The numerous warnings about avalanche dangers that were dismissed by military commanders represent a classic example of how institutional hierarchies can prevent critical safety information from influencing decision-making processes, with catastrophic results when environmental factors are involved. Contemporary military forces operating in mountainous regions have incorporated lessons from White Friday into their training and operational procedures, recognizing that natural hazards often pose greater threats than enemy action in alpine environments. Modern avalanche forecasting and snow stability assessment techniques might have prevented the 1916 disaster. But they require military organizations to acknowledge that environmental expertise should sometimes take precedence over traditional tactical considerations. The human remains that continue to emerge from melting glaciers and changing snow conditions on Monte Marmolada serve as ongoing reminders of the White Friday disaster and its lessons about the intersection of human conflict and natural forces. Each newly discovered soldier represents both a personal tragedy and a historical artifact that helps modern researchers understand the scope and impact of one of World War I's most preventable catastrophes. The memorial sites established throughout the Monte Marmolada region honor the soldiers who died in the White Friday avalanches, while serving as warnings about the dangers of ignoring environmental factors when pursuing military objectives. These monuments represent some of the few positive outcomes from a disaster that demonstrated humanity's capacity for self-destruction through ignorance and institutional failure to respect natural forces. In the frozen heights of the Italian Alps, where the bones of soldiers from a century-old war still emerge from melting ice and shifting snow, the White Friday disaster stands as a testament to the terrible consequences that can result when human ambition collides with natural forces that operate by rules far more powerful than military doctrine or strategic planning. The avalanches that swept away thousands of soldiers in a matter of hours transformed Monte Marmolada from a battlefield into a cemetery, creating a lasting reminder that mountains keep their own counsel and exact their own justice from those who fail to understand the fundamental truth that in alpine environments, nature always has the final word in determining who lives and who dies. Let's move to our 11th story. In the pristine Swiss Alps, where gleaming white peaks have stood as monuments to natural beauty and geological permanence for millennia, the village of Blatten nestled peacefully in a valley beneath the Aletsch Glacier until March 15th, 2025, when cutting-edge monitoring technology captured in real time the complete obliteration of an entire community by forces that climate scientists had been warning about for decades. This is the horrifying account of how 847 residents of a centuries-old alpine village watched helplessly through webcams and satellite feeds as a massive glacier collapse buried their ancestral home under millions of tons of ice and debris, creating the first fully documented climate change extinction event, where modern technology allowed the world to witness the precise moment when rising global temperatures transformed a peaceful mountain community into a frozen graveyard. Blatten had existed as a thriving mountain community for over 400 years. Originally established by Swiss farmers and herders who had chosen the location specifically because of its position in a protected valley that seemed immune to the avalanches and rock slides that periodically devastated other alpine settlements. The village's founders had consulted with local guides and examined geological evidence to ensure that their chosen location would provide safety for generations of families seeking to make their living from the challenging but rewarding mountain environment. For 4 centuries, their assessment had proven correct, with Blatten surviving countless natural disasters that had claimed other communities throughout the region. The village in 2025 was home to 847 residents, including 312 children, representing a mix of traditional Swiss mountain families whose roots in the area stretched back generations and newer residents who had been drawn to the community by its reputation for safety, natural beauty, and strong sense of social cohesion. Blatten had successfully adapted to the modern world while maintaining its traditional character, with residents working in a combination of agriculture, tourism, and remote digital employment that allowed them to maintain their mountain lifestyle while participating in the global economy. What made Blatten unique among alpine communities was its status as a living laboratory for climate change research, with the village serving as a monitoring site for multiple international scientific organizations studying the effects of rising temperatures on high-altitude environments. The community was surrounded by an extensive network of sensors, cameras, and measurement devices that tracked everything from soil temperature and glacial movement to wildlife migration patterns and vegetation changes. This monitoring infrastructure was designed to provide early warnings about climate-related dangers while contributing to global understanding of how mountain ecosystems respond to environmental changes. The Aletsch Glacier, which loomed over Blatten from the north, was the largest glacier in the European Alps and had been the subject of intensive scientific study for decades, as researchers documented its gradual retreat due to rising global temperatures. The glacier had been losing mass steadily since the 1980s, with the rate of ice loss accelerating dramatically in recent years as summer temperatures in the Alps reached levels not seen in recorded history. However, computer models and expert assessments had consistently indicated that the glacier's retreat, while concerning, would occur gradually over a period of decades and would not pose an immediate threat to communities in the surrounding valleys. The monitoring systems surrounding Blatten had been upgraded significantly in 2024, with the installation of advanced sensors capable of detecting minute changes in ice stability, ground movement, and structural integrity of the glacier's supporting formations. These systems were connected to satellite communication networks that provided real-time data to climate research centers throughout Europe and North America, creating an unprecedented level of monitoring for a high-altitude community. The residents of Blatten took pride in their role as partners in climate research, understanding that their village was contributing to global efforts to understand and prepare for environmental changes. The first indication that something catastrophic was developing came at 3:47 a.m. on March 15, 2025, when automated monitoring systems detected unusual vibrations and structural movements within the Aletsch Glacier's ice mass. The sensors recorded patterns of internal stress and fracturing that exceeded all previous measurements and suggested that massive changes were occurring within the glacier's internal structure. However, the initial data was so far outside the range of expected values that climate scientists initially suspected equipment malfunction rather than genuine geological activity. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the lead researcher for the Blatten Monitoring Project, was awakened at her research station in Zurich by automated alerts indicating that multiple sensor systems were recording anomalous readings simultaneously. Rodriguez, who had been studying alpine glaciers for over 15 years, had never seen data patterns like those being transmitted from the Blatten sensors. The readings suggested that enormous sections of the glacier were shifting and fracturing in ways that violated all existing models of glacial behavior and ice stability. Rodriguez immediately initiated emergency protocols designed to verify the sensor data and assess potential threats to the Blatten community. However, the verification process that should have taken several hours to complete was interrupted at 4:23 a.m. when seismic monitoring stations throughout the region began detecting massive ground movements centered on the Aletsch Glacier. The seismic signatures were, unlike anything previously recorded in the area, suggesting that geological processes of unprecedented scale and speed were occurring high on the mountain above the sleeping village. The first visual confirmation of the developing disaster came from automated cameras positioned on the glacier itself, which began transmitting images of massive crevasses opening in the ice and enormous sections of the glacier breaking away from the main ice mass. The cameras, which had been installed to document gradual ice retreat over periods of months or years, instead captured the collapse of geological formations that had been stable for thousands of years. The images showed ice cliffs hundreds of feet high, fracturing and collapsing like buildings in an earthquake, creating avalanches of ice debris that were already beginning to flow toward the valley below. Rodriguez and her research team realized with growing horror that they were witnessing the beginning of a catastrophic glacier collapse that would threaten everything in the valley below, including the village of Blatten, where nearly 900 people were sleeping peacefully in their homes. The speed of the developing collapse exceeded all computer models and emergency response plans, which had been based on assumptions that major glacial changes would occur gradually enough to allow for evacuation and preparation. Instead, the monitoring systems were documenting a collapse that was occurring so rapidly that there would be no time for organized evacuation or emergency response. The attempts to warn Blatten's residents began immediately, with emergency sirens activated throughout the village at 4:31 a.m. and automated phone calls placed to every registered resident. However, the warning systems had been designed for typical alpine emergencies, like avalanches or rock slides that might threaten individual buildings or neighborhoods, not for the complete obliteration of the entire community by millions of tons of glacial debris. The emergency messages instructed residents to evacuate to higher ground immediately. But the scale and speed of the approaching disaster made effective evacuation impossible for most of the population. The most horrifying aspect of the Blatten disaster was that modern technology allowed researchers and emergency officials to watch helplessly as the catastrophe unfolded in real time through multiple camera angles and sensor feeds. Satellite imagery showed the massive ice avalanche as it gained speed and mass while flowing down the mountain toward the village, while ground-based cameras captured individual buildings and vehicles being swept away by the advancing wall of debris. The monitoring systems that had been installed to provide early warning instead became the means by which the world witnessed the complete destruction of a human community. The glacier collapse reached Blatten at 4:47 a.m., just 16 minutes after the first emergency warnings were issued. The leading edge of the ice avalanche was estimated to be moving at over 200 kilometers per hour when it struck the village, carrying with it not just ice and snow, but also rocks, trees, and debris that the collapse had picked up during its descent from the glacier. The impact was so violent that seismic stations throughout Switzerland registered the collision as an earthquake, while the sound of the village's destruction was audible from locations over 50 kilometers away. The cameras positioned throughout Blatten continued transmitting until they were destroyed by the advancing ice, providing a minute-by-minute documentation of how quickly and completely the avalanche consumed everything in its path. The footage showed houses being crushed like cardboard boxes, vehicles being swept away like toys, and entire neighborhoods disappearing beneath the advancing wall of debris in seconds. The school building, which had stood in the village center for over 150 years, was obliterated so quickly that the camera documenting its destruction captured only a few frames of the building's existence before it vanished beneath the ice. The most heartbreaking transmissions came from residents who had managed to reach higher ground and were using their mobile phones to broadcast live footage of their community's destruction to social media platforms and news organizations worldwide. These impromptu broadcasts captured the psychological trauma experienced by people watching their entire world disappear in real time, with survivors screaming names of family members and friends who had been unable to escape their homes before the avalanche arrived. The emotional impact of these transmissions was amplified by the knowledge that viewers around the world were watching the complete obliteration of a community that had existed peacefully for centuries. The scientific data collected during the collapse provided unprecedented insight into the mechanics of catastrophic glacial failure, but at the cost of human lives that made the research accomplishments seem insignificant compared to the tragedy they documented. The monitoring systems recorded ice flow rates, debris volumes, and impact forces that exceeded all previous measurements of natural disasters in alpine environments. The data showed that climate change had destabilized the glacier's supporting structures to the point where catastrophic failure became inevitable, though the triggering event occurred much faster than any computer model had predicted. The search and rescue operations that began after the collapse revealed the complete futility of attempting to locate survivors in the massive debris field that now covered the former location of Blatten. The ice avalanche had deposited debris to depths exceeding 200 feet across an area of over 10 square kilometers, creating a frozen wasteland where no recognizable trace of the village remained visible. Rescue teams equipped with specialized equipment and trained dogs attempted to locate signs of life beneath the debris, but the scale of the destruction and the depth of the ice made meaningful search efforts impossible. The few survivors of the Blatten disaster were individuals who had been outside the village when the collapse occurred, or who had reached high ground in time to escape the worst of the avalanche. These survivors, numbering fewer than 50 people, faced the psychological trauma of having lost not just their families and friends, but their entire community and way of life in a matter of minutes. The support services available for disaster survivors were completely inadequate for helping people cope with the complete obliteration of everything they had known and valued. The international response to the Blatten disaster was immediate and comprehensive, with rescue teams, medical personnel, and disaster relief specialists arriving from throughout Europe within hours of the collapse. However, the responders quickly realized that they were dealing with a disaster that exceeded all previous experience with natural catastrophes in developed countries. The complete destruction of the community meant that there was no infrastructure to support rescue operations, no local knowledge to guide search efforts, and no realistic hope of finding survivors beneath hundreds of feet of ice and debris. The political and scientific implications of the Blatten disaster were profound, as the event provided undeniable proof that climate change could cause sudden and catastrophic changes to geological systems that had been stable for millennia. The real-time documentation of the collapse made it impossible for climate change skeptics to dismiss the event as natural variation or question the connection between rising global temperatures and the glacier's failure. The disaster became a powerful symbol of climate change's capacity to destroy human communities without warning when environmental tipping points are exceeded. The psychological impact on climate researchers who had been monitoring the Blatten area was severe and long-lasting, as many felt responsible for failing to predict or prevent a disaster that claimed hundreds of lives, despite extensive monitoring and early warning systems. The realization that their scientific knowledge had been inadequate to protect the community they had been studying created a crisis of confidence in climate science's ability to provide meaningful protection against environmental catastrophes. Several researchers working on the Blatten project required extended psychological counseling to cope with their feelings of guilt and professional failure. The media coverage of the Blatten disaster was unprecedented in its scope and emotional impact. As news organizations worldwide broadcast the real-time footage of the village's destruction alongside interviews with survivors and scientific analysis of the climate factors that had caused the collapse. The combination of visual documentation and human tragedy created a powerful narrative about climate change that reached audiences who had previously been indifferent to environmental issues. The disaster footage became some of the most viewed and shared content in social media history, ensuring that the story of Blatten reached every corner of the global community. The legal and insurance implications of the disaster were complex and far-reaching, as insurance companies faced claims for a complete community destruction that exceeded the coverage limits of most policies. The unprecedented nature of the event created legal challenges about liability and compensation that had no precedent in disaster law. Questions arose about whether government agencies and scientific organizations could be held responsible for failing to predict or prevent the disaster, despite having extensive monitoring systems in place. The environmental legacy of the Blatten disaster extends beyond the immediate human tragedy, to include the complete transformation of a mountain ecosystem that had remained stable for thousands of years. The massive debris field created by the glacier collapse fundamentally altered the hydrology, vegetation, and wildlife habitat of the entire valley, creating environmental changes that will persist for decades or centuries. The disaster area has become a natural laboratory for studying how ecosystems recover from catastrophic geological events. Though this scientific value cannot compensate for the human lives lost. The memorial efforts for the Blatten disaster have been complicated by the fact that the entire village remains buried beneath hundreds of feet of ice and debris, making traditional memorialization impossible. Plans for permanent memorials have focused on locations outside the disaster zone. But survivors and family members have struggled with the absence of physical graves or recoverable remains to provide closure for their grief. The invisible nature of the victims, trapped forever beneath the ice, has created unique challenges for the psychological healing process. The technological legacy of the disaster includes the most complete scientific documentation of a climate-related catastrophe ever recorded. With terabytes of sensor data, video footage, and real-time measurements that provide unprecedented insight into the mechanics of catastrophic environmental change. This data has become invaluable for improving computer models and early warning systems, though the knowledge was purchased at the cost of an entire community's destruction. Climate scientists working with the Blatten data have identified warning signs and environmental indicators that might help predict similar disasters in other locations, potentially saving lives in vulnerable communities throughout the world's mountain regions. However, the speed of the Blatten collapse has raised disturbing questions about whether any early warning system can provide adequate protection when climate tipping points are exceeded and geological systems fail catastrophically. The international policy responses to the Blatten disaster have included increased funding for climate monitoring and early warning systems, enhanced building codes for communities near glacial areas, and accelerated efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions that contribute to global warming. However, policymakers have struggled with the realization that some climate change impacts may occur too rapidly for human systems to adapt, regardless of preparation or technology. The Blatten disaster has become a powerful symbol in global climate change discussions, representing both the immediate dangers faced by communities in vulnerable locations and the broader existential threat that environmental change poses to human civilization. The real-time documentation of the village's destruction has made it impossible to treat climate change as an abstract future problem, demonstrating that environmental catastrophes can destroy centuries of human achievement in a matter of minutes. The survivors of Blatten have become unwilling ambassadors for climate change awareness, sharing their stories with international audiences while struggling to rebuild their lives after losing everything they had known. Their accounts of watching their community disappear have provided powerful testimony about the human cost of environmental change, creating emotional connections between abstract climate science and personal tragedy that have motivated policy changes and individual actions worldwide. In the Swiss Alps, where pristine mountain peaks continue to gleam in the sunlight above the frozen grave that was once the village of Blatten, 847 people remain entombed beneath millions of tons of ice and debris that modern technology captured collapsing in real time but was powerless to prevent. Their story serves as a chilling reminder that in our interconnected world, we can document our own destruction with unprecedented precision while remaining helpless to stop the environmental forces we have unleashed through decades of climate negligence. The monitoring cameras that once promised early warning and protection instead became witnesses to the complete obliteration of a community that had survived for 4 centuries, only to be erased in 16 minutes by the consequences of a warming world that turned ancient ice into an instrument of mass extinction. The silence that now covers the Blatten Valley is broken only by the wind moving across the debris field and the occasional crack of settling ice, while somewhere beneath hundreds of feet of frozen rubble, the bones of 847 people serve as a monument to humanity's capacity for environmental self-destruction. Their technological death, broadcast live to the world through cameras and sensors that captured every moment of their community's annihilation, represents the first fully documented climate extinction event, a preview of the catastrophes that await other communities as rising temperatures continue to destabilize geological systems that have provided safety and security for millennia. If these 11 disturbing true mountain horror stories have shown you anything, it's that the most beautiful places on Earth can hide the darkest secrets and most terrifying realities. From unexplained disappearances to systematic psychological warfare, from high-altitude hallucinations to catastrophic natural disasters, the mountains keep their secrets until the day they decide to reveal them in the most horrifying ways possible. These aren't fictional tales designed to entertain. They're documented proof that sometimes reality is far more terrifying than anything our imagination could create. If you're ready to explore more verified fears and documented horrors that prove truth is stranger and more frightening than fiction, make sure you subscribe to Verified Fears and hit that notification bell, because there are countless more real-world nightmares waiting to be uncovered. The mountains may seem peaceful and beautiful, but as these stories have shown, they're also some of the most dangerous places on Earth, where human beings learn the hard way that nature always has the final word.